The wine at an ascension banquet is poured by house rank. House Dell is ninth of 9, so mine comes last and out of the bottom of the jug, and in 22 years I have never once minded. It arrives with the sediment. Sediment is free. Yuna poured it. Yuna has poured for the ridge since she was 11, and she hands me a cup the way other people hand over something breakable. She told me my collar was crooked, and that the pharaoh table had been watching the door since the second gong. I said it was probably just the collar. She said it was probably not just the collar. My betrothed sat at that table. Saren of House Pharaoh and I were promised to each other when we were 9 on account of a road. The road crosses my family's mountain, and her family would prefer it cross theirs. I drank the cup. It tasted like a bad year, which is what a ninth pour tastes like, and I said so out loud to nobody in particular. And Audrey, our steward, leaned over and asked whether the frost had held on the north slope. I told him it had. He said good, because the picking starts Thursday. Then the room tilted about 4 degrees to the left and decided to stay there. Saren crossed the hall to me, which in 13 years of being promised she had done twice, both times to say my house was late with something. She put her hand on my sleeve and said, "The hall is too warm for you. Go and sit by the east window. I will come and find you." Behind her, Doha stood with his thumbs in his belt. He is the sworn sword of House Pharaoh, and he said, "Mind the stairs, Dell." And then he said it again, louder, turning his head so both neighboring tables heard him being kind to me. I got up. I remember apologizing to a bench. The east wing is on the second floor of the guest range. Somewhere between the stairhead and the landing, my legs made a decision without consulting me and took one flight more than they had been asked for. Third floor, north side. Every door on the ridge is the same door, oak and black iron, and at that moment there were roughly 4 of each of them, breathing gently. I put my hand on the one that held still, and it opened. The room behind it was long and cold, and smelled of whetstone. Maps on the table, a lamp turned low, one chair. I got 2 strides in before the floor, and I stopped negotiating. And I went down on one knee, and then both. Then, I heard somebody breathing very carefully. It is a particular way of breathing. You hear it from people who have been holding still a long time and would like to go on holding still. A woman stood at the far end of the table in gray, with her gloves on and the lamp behind her, and no part of her was moving. She said, "Do you know whose room this is?" Her voice did not lift at the end of it. I said no, and that I had been looking for the east wing, and that I was fairly certain the east wing had been on this side of the building the last time I used it. "The east wing is 1 floor down," she said. Then she said, "Stand up slowly, and do not come any nearer than you already are. Every child on the ridge learns 2 facts before they learn to ride. The passes are held by House Sunder, and nobody walks inside 3 paces of the Warden. It is not said the way warnings are said. It is said the way you are told, which slope carries snow into spring. There is a fence there. The fence is a fact. You stand outside it, and you get on with your day." So I stood up, and I stopped, and I did not go forward. I was blind on something that was not drink. My legs were not mine, and my hands belonged to a stranger, and I stopped at 3 paces, because when I was 6 years old, somebody told me there was a line, and I had never once had a reason to go and check. Below us, a door went, and then more doors, and then the noise 30 people make on a staircase when they are pretending not to hurry. She crossed and turned the key without haste, as you close a shutter before weather comes over the ridgeline, and then she stood with her back against the door and put her hands behind her. The first knock was polite. The second was not. The third arrived with Doha's voice behind it, and Doha's voice had a smile in it I could hear through 2 fingers of oak. He said, "Warden, forgive the disturbance. We seek a man of House Dell who has done a great dishonor tonight, and we have witnesses." "Witnesses," he said. He wanted the words standing in the corridor before the door was even open. She turned the key back, opened it herself, stepped 1 pace clear, and let the entire corridor look into the room. Then she said it. She said, "He is mine." I would like to be able to describe what 30 faces do when they have been promised one thing and are shown another. The 2 at the front had their mouths already open on the word they had climbed the stairs to say. Behind them, Saren had a hand held out toward the doorway, as though presenting the room to a buyer. Behind her, 4 house heads stood in a neat half circle. That is how you can always tell that people have been placed rather than gathered. Every single face did the same small stupid thing in the same order. Look at me. Look at how far I was standing from her. Look again, go the color of ash. Because I was inside the room, the door had been locked from within, and I was standing 3 paces from Vaelka of House Sunder, alive, with my hands at my sides. Doha got out half a sentence. He said, "Warden, the man is found." Then he stopped, because he had not decided in advance what the second half was going to be if the first half went wrong. Saren said, "My Lord Warden, there has been a terrible mistake. My betrothed is unwell." And then she began to explain, which is the single most dangerous thing about her, and she has no idea it is there. She explained that he had been unwell since the cup. She explained that she had sent him down to the East Wing, where there would have been people ready to help him. She explained that the 2 men who broke the East door had only been sent to help. Kesta, our master of seniority, who was standing in that corridor because Kesta is standing in every corridor, said, "Sent by whom?" Saren did not answer. Her mouth had already made the shape of the answer, and about 40 pairs of eyes went straight past her to the man with his thumbs in his belt. Somewhere at the back, a cup went over on the boards. That was Ilna, Saren's younger sister, who was 14 the first time she tried to warn me about something, and has not been believed by anybody since. Doha recovered. He said, "Forgive me, Warden, but the man is betrothed to House Pharaoh, and there are terms, and there is a road. I did not follow the rest of it because I was busy making my own contribution." I said, respectfully, "I am not hers." I had lived on the ridge 22 years without once speaking in a room containing 4 house heads, and the first thing I ever said in one was that. Vaelka did not look at me. She said, "In 11 years he is the only man who has come into a room with me and stopped where he was told. He is mine. Have the master of seniority measure it." Esta had her rod out before the sentence finished. She has held the seniority table for 19 years and has never redrawn it in the middle of a feast, and you could see the whole of her wanting this. She came in and laid the rod flat on the boards between us and measured it there, in front of 4 house heads, 2 pharaohs, 1 sworn sword, 30 guests, and a wine girl who had climbed onto a bench in the corridor to see over the shoulders in front of her. Then she tapped the boards twice with 2 fingers where I was standing, which is what Kesta does before she names who a place belongs to, and she got up and gave the number to the corridor. She said 3 paces, and the corridor said it back to her like a hall saying a house name at the door. 3 paces. That number had stood for 11 years, without once measuring where a living man was. It had been the depth of the water people drowned in. That night, it became somewhere a person was standing. Now I can tell you what the evening had been built for, because Yuna told me every bit of it afterwards, and Yuna had it from the kitchen, and the kitchen had it from the boy who carries the ash buckets out through the East Wing at the 9th gong. Doha had hired 2 men out of the past villages, and 1 woman out of a house in the low town. The woman was to be waiting in the East Wing. The 2 men were to break the door at the 9th gong and shout loudly enough to carry down a stairwell. The witnesses were invited before the first course. That is the piece I still admire. He went round the hall telling 4 house heads and their wives that a matter concerning House Dell would repay their attention later in the evening, and every one of them came. A betrothal broken is one thing. A betrothal broken with cause is another. With cause, House Pharaoh keeps its claim on the road and takes my mountain in compensation for the insult, and nobody on the ridge is required to feel anything about it afterwards. Saren chose the cup. Doha chose the wine. Yuna poured it, and Yuna did not know, and I am going to have to come back to that because it cost her more than it cost me. The 2 hired men did their work exactly as they had been paid to do it. At the 9th gong, they broke the East Wing door off its upper hinge and shouted about dishonor into a corridor, on time, at full volume. They shouted it to nobody at all, because every single person who was meant to be watching had gone up a flight of stairs to watch something better. They shouted twice. The woman from the low town waited a decent while, formed her own view of the situation, and left through the kitchen yard with a jug of Pharaoh wine, which I hope she enjoyed. The kitchen votes on everything, and it voted on me that night. Yuna says it went 11-4 in favor of my being either the bravest man on the ridge or dead before morning, and that 4 of them held out for both at once. The corridor emptied downward and took the number with it. Kesta went last, walking backwards for 3 steps because she was still looking at the boards, which left me in a cold room with a woman I had been raised to stand away from, and no clear idea what a person does next. She crouched, not nearer, just down to my level, forearms on her knees, gloved hands hanging, and she watched my eyes as our stablemen watch a horse that has been at something in the long meadow. She said, "How many of me are there?" I said 4, but that 2 of them were being reasonable about it. She said, "That passes by morning." I said that was a relief, because 2 of her was already a considerable quantity of Warden. She did not laugh. Nobody in that house laughs. But something happened at the corner of her mouth and then unhappened, and I have thought about it a great deal since. Up close, she smelled of whetstone and frost pear. Frost pear is my mountain. Dell grows it and nobody else does, because nobody else has one face that goes cold enough and another with a hot spring running under it. I assumed everybody's cellar has our pears in it. I am told this is the stupidest single assumption I made all year, and there is competition. She stood and went back round her table and said without turning, "The physician sleeps in the west range. I have sent for him, and you will use the north guest room tonight because it is beside a door I can hear." I said that was very kind, but that I had a cot in the 9th house lodging. She said you had. I said, "And now?" She said, "Now you have a room, and stop counting me." I asked to be judged gently on what I concluded from all this, because it lasted a long time, and at the outset it was entirely reasonable. I concluded that she had covered for me. A powerful woman had watched a young man being set up under her own roof, and had stopped it in the fastest way available. She said the one thing nobody in that corridor was going to argue with. It was a courtesy. Courtesies end. The picking starts Thursday, and the north slope does not pick itself, and I intended to be off the ridge by second light with my thanks properly conveyed through Audrey. I told Audrey so on the stairs. Audrey considered it and asked whether being claimed by the warden was likely to move the dates. I said I did not think so. He said good, because the drying sheds were only half swept. The women who are going to matter in this were all inside that building, and I could not have named 3 of them. Una on a bench with a jug against her hip, Kesta on her knees on the boards with a rod, Rel of Housekite asleep in a guest room, counting nothing yet, Maeve of Housetor at the high table, already working out a price for a thing she had heard about 8 minutes ago, Ilna of House Pharaoh at the back, holding a fallen cup she had picked up off the floor and did not hand to anybody, and 1 story above the lot of them, alone with the maps, a woman in gray kidskin gloves who had just told 9 houses that a pear farmer belonged to her and who had not touched a living thing with a bare hand in 11 years. I slept in the north guest room, which had a fire in it, and I slept extremely well. Everybody involved agrees that this is the most annoying detail of the entire business. In the morning, there were 14 people waiting in the passage outside that door. One of them was a househead. None of them were waiting for anybody else. Eis Atzens ein. I opened that door expecting a physician and got a passage. 14 people. 2 of them were holding hats. One of them was Harn of House Vane, who is 4th of 9 and has never in his life stood in a corridor waiting for anybody, and who had brought his own chair. Harn said, "Good morning." And then he said my name with the house attached, Toren of House Dell, which nobody had done since my father died. Then he asked me, in the tone men use for weather and war, what the trick was. I said there was no trick. He said, of course, and lowered his voice and asked again what the trick was. Behind him, a man from House Ossel wanted to know whether it was the boots. He had noticed I was wearing plain hill boots with a double sole, and he had a theory about the sound of a footfall on boards. I told him they were my father's boots and that the left one leaks. He wrote that down. He actually wrote it down on a folded paper with a stub of chalk, and I watched him underline the word leaks. 2 of the 14 were there to sell me things. One was there about a marriage, though he would not say whose. One was a physician after all, and he was at the back, and by the time he reached me, it was nearly noon, and I had explained about the boots 11 times. It would be pleasant to say I handled this with dignity. What I did was answer every question honestly, which on the ridge is indistinguishable from a man protecting a secret, and by the 2nd hour, my honesty had become the most discussed strategy on the mountain. Maeve of Housetor arrived last, because Housetor is 2nd of 9, and 2nd of 9 does not queue. She came down the passage, and the 14 folded back against the wall without being asked, and she stopped in front of me and said, 40. Anne swakainaris, me in I said, 40 what? She said, 40 grown pear trees, taken up whole with the root ball, replanted on the south face of Tor, and a wall built round them at our cost, and you to come with them. I said no. She said that was quick. I said the trees would die because Del Pear needs a cold face and a hot spring under it, and Tor has neither. She said, that is a horticultural objection. I said it was the only kind I had. Then she held out her house seal on its cord, as another person might offer a sweet to a child, and waited for me to take it. I did not take it. She put it back inside her coat with the expression of a woman noting down a peculiar weather event. That was the first offer. There were going to be a great many more, and every one of them arrived with the number first and the thing afterwards, and every one of them was refused inside a breath, and she never once looked discouraged. Enjoying herself is closer. At the 11th hour of that morning, I gave up on politeness and went to find Audrey, who had the ponies saddled already because Audrey saddles ponies the way other men breathe. I said we were going home. He said good and asked whether we would stop at the low town for hinges because the drying sheds are only half swept and one of the doors has gone. Got about 40 steps past the stable arch before a boy caught us and said the master of seniority requested that House Dell not leave before the evening announcement. I said we had a picking. He said he had been told to expect that. I said, what else were you told to expect? He said that you will say it politely and go anyway, and that I am to walk beside the pony. He walked beside the pony. He walked beside it for the entire length of the yard and back, and I did not get out of the gate. And that is how a house of 14 servants learns that it has become interesting. Doha was in the yard by then, and Doha had spent the night building a theory about the floor of the North Study. He had it out in front of 40 people before I had dismounted. He said loudly that a measurement taken at speed on a cold floor by lamplight in a room nobody had checked was not a measurement at all, and that House Pharaoh required it done again in daylight on level ground. I would rather be fair to him. It was not a stupid thought. If somebody had told me a man had stood 3 paces from the warden and walked away, I would also have looked at the floor. Kesta came out with the rod under her arm and her sleeves already pushed up. She said, on level ground. Doha said, on level ground. She said, name your witnesses then, because I will not do it twice. He named 9. He was that confident. He stood there in the middle of the yard and named 9 witnesses out loud, one from each house, and sent boys running for all of them, and then he waited with his thumbs in his belt while they came. They came. The yard filled up. Yuna got onto the mounting block with a jug she was not currently using, and the kitchen came out through the low door and pretended to be doing something with sacks. Vaelka came down the steps, and the entire yard dropped half a tone, as a room does when she is in it, and 40 people found something to look at. That was not her. Esta chalked a line on the flags. She put Vaelka on one side of it. She said to me, stand where you stood, and I said I had no idea where I had stood. I had been under a table for part of it. Somebody at the back laughed and turned it into a cough. So Kesta reconstructed it. She made me walk in from the yard arch, the way I had come through the door, and she stopped me where I stopped, which took 3 attempts because the first 2 times I stopped too early out of nerves. Then she laid the rod down on the flags in daylight, on level ground, in front of 9 named witnesses and about 90 unnamed ones, and she measured it. She tapped the stone twice with 2 fingers. She stood up. She said 3 paces, and then, because she is not a kind woman, she said, the challenger will confirm the count. Doha had to say it himself. He got out the word 3 and then had to add the word paces to it, in his own voice, in the middle of a yard he had filled on purpose, and he did it while looking at the flags. Then he said the thing that finished him for the morning. He said, then let it be recorded that House Pharaoh does not dispute the distance. And Kesta said, House Pharaoh disputed it at second light and brought 9 witnesses. Shall I record that as well? He said nothing. The yard did the arithmetic out loud instead, as yards do, and somebody near the sacks said that the 9th house had now been measured twice and had come out the same twice. Somebody else said that was more than you could say for the Pharaoh Road survey, and the kitchen went back inside laughing. Vaelka had not moved through any of it. When it was over, she crossed to the chalk line and stood on her own side of it and said, are you satisfied? And Doha said, Warden, I am satisfied. And she said, good. Then you may go and see to the east wing door, since your house broke it. He went to see to the door. A sworn sword of the 3rd house spent that afternoon holding a hinge plate for a carpenter, in the open, on the ground floor, where people walk past. I did not enjoy that as much as I should have. I was still working out how to get to Thursday. I asked her about it directly, because directly is the only way I know how to ask things. I said, we doetsas stosowers eyes. Warden, my picking starts Thursday, and my north slope will not wait for the ridge. May I go home? She said, yes. I said, thank you. She said, when? I said Thursday, at second light, and it is a day and a half by the low road with carts. She said, a day and a half. Then she said, the low road or the winter path. I said the low road because carts. She said nothing else at all and went back up the steps, and I decided that was the end of it. Yuna found me on the mounting block afterwards and told me what color Vaelka's gloves had been that morning before she told me anything else, because that is how Yuna delivers information. Gray kid skin, she said, same as always, and both of them on. Then she said, both of them on is not the interesting half of it. Ask me what she does with the left one. I said, what does she do with the left one? Yuna said, nothing. Ever. In 4 years of pouring at that table, I have never seen her hand. Neither has anybody in the kitchen, and the kitchen has seen the inside of everything. Yuna has a slate she carries for the wine, houses down one side and jugs down the other. That day, I found out she writes on the back of it as well, and has done for 4 years, and that a good deal of what is on the back of it is me. She said, do not look at me like that. You are the 9th house. Nothing happens to the 9th house. For 4 years, you have been the only thing in this building that ever changed slowly enough to follow. I said that was the saddest thing anybody had ever said to me. She said it was not, and that if I wanted the saddest thing anybody had ever said to me, she had that written down too, with the date. Then she stopped talking and looked at the jug and said, I poured it. I said she poured every cup in the hall. She said, I poured that one, and I handed it to you. And I told you your collar was crooked. I said the collar was crooked. She said, that is not the point. And I said I knew, and we left it there. Because Yuna does not cry in a yard where the kitchen can see her. Audrey came past at that moment and asked her whether the kitchen had a spare hinge, because the drying shed door was still off, and Thursday was Thursday. She said no. He said it had been worth asking and went. She laughed into the jug, and he has never once known that he does that. She has not stopped paying for it since, and she pays in the only currency she has. She tells me everything she hears, whether I want it or not, usually before it has finished happening. The evening hall is where the ridge announces itself to itself. 9 houses seated by seniority. The master of seniority standing at the head with her rod and a reading that has not changed in 140 years. Kesta reads the houses in order. Then she reads the standing of the warden of the ridge. It is a number. For 11 years it has been 3, and for 11 years nobody has listened to it, in the way you do not listen to a bell you live beside. That evening she came in with her chalk and her table, and she did a thing she has not done in 19 years of holding it. She redrew it in front of the room. She said, House-Dell is at present the 9th. She said, House-Dell is at present the 9th, and I do not know a table on this ridge that can seat a house at 9th when the warden has spoken its name. Then she moved us, not to the top. Kesta does not do gifts. She moved us to 7th, above Kite and above Culm, and she said the words out loud twice so that the boys writing it down got it right. Culm took it well. Kite took it less well, because Burn of House Kite had spent the afternoon sending a rider somewhere and had not expected to come home to a lower chair. Doha lost his stool. This is a small thing, and I have never enjoyed anything more. A sworn sword sits at the foot of his house's table, and when the table moved along the wall, the foot of it went behind a pillar. There is no seniority on this ridge that will let a man drag his own stool out from behind a pillar in front of 9 houses. He sat behind the pillar all evening. Every so often, he leaned out to hear something, and then had to lean back. Ilna came and stood by my chair, while her sister was up at the faro table with their father. She is 19, and she does not finish sentences when Saren is in a room. She said, 5 years ago I tried to. I waited. She said, at the winter market, I tried to say something to you about my sister and you. I said I remembered. I did remember. She had been 14, and she had said something short about how I should mind who poured for me, and I had laughed, because a 14-year-old girl had just told a boy of 17 to be careful, and it had sounded like a joke. She said it was not a. Then Saren turned round at the head of the hall, and Ilna stopped mid-word, put down the cup she was carrying, and went and stood behind her sister's chair with her hands folded. She has been carrying that cup since the corridor, the one that went over on the boards. She washed it and she kept it, and nobody has asked her for it back. and I did not know then that it was going to matter. Saren was explaining. She had been explaining for most of the evening at the head of her own table to her father in a hall with a ceiling built to carry a voice. She explained that the betrothal stood because nothing improper had occurred. She explained that the two men in the East Wing were past villagers who had been engaged for the evening as extra hands. She explained that she had personally instructed them to be at the East Wing at the 9th gong. Merrick of House Pharaoh, who is her father and is not a fool, said, "Engaged by whom?" She said, "By me." Then, a beat later, and by Doha. And the hall heard both halves, and the second half arrived at the same speed as the first, and Merrick put his hand flat on the table and did not lift it again for some time. That is Saren. She will not lie to her own father. She will simply keep talking until the truth walks out of her by itself, and then she will explain the truth as well. At the end of the reading, Kesta went to the head of the hall and gave the standing of the warden. It is a formality. She gives it every night to a room that is already putting its coats on. Nobody put a coat on. 200 people sat in a stone hall and waited for a number they had known their whole lives. Kesta said, "The warden of the ridge stands at 3 paces. Then she said the name. She said, "And at 3 paces stands Toren of House Dell." That had never been said before. In 140 years of that reading, the second half of it had never had a name in it, because for 11 years, there had been nothing to put there, and before that, there had been no need. The hall said it back to her, 200 people all at once out of habit, in the way you answer a bell. 3 paces. I went out through the yard afterwards to check that Audrey had the carts loaded for Thursday, and Audrey said the carts were loaded, and then he said that a rider of House Kite had gone up the low road at noon with a covered litter and a letter, and had asked directions to Mount Dell twice. The low road takes a day and a half with carts, and you smell my mountain before you see it, because a Dell frost pear on the tree in picking week smells like something baking 2 valleys away. We came up through the lower orchard at the back end of the second afternoon, and the entire crop was standing there in rows going gold at the shoulder, and I got down off the cart and stood in it for a while and did not talk to anybody. I am going to say this once, and then leave it alone. I was glad. Everybody on the ridge had spent 2 days telling me what had happened to me, and none of them had mentioned that a man might be glad about anything. And I was, and the reason was rows of trees. Audrey came past with the first empty crates and said the north face had come on 4 days early and that we would want every hand on the hill by Thursday. I said we had every hand on the hill. He said we had 13 people, and one of them was his mother. Then he said, "And there is a girl in the drying shed counting our baskets." There was. She had been there since noon the previous day. She had a litter and 2 kite men camped by the spring, and she was walking the middle aisle of the shed, touching each stack and saying the running total out loud. She said 106 without looking up. Then she said, "Your baskets are short." Then she looked up and said, "Rel of House Kite, and my father has written to you." The letter was 4 lines long, and 3 of them were about weather. The 4th said that House Kite wished to place its eldest daughter at Mount Dell for a season to study the frost pear trade, and that no answer was necessary. I said no answer was necessary because none was expected, and Rel said none is expected, and neither of us said the other half of it out loud. House Kite had dropped 1 place at the evening reading on the same day I gained 2. She said, "I want to be clear about my position." I said, "Please." She said, "I am here to find out what you are. My father thinks you have a method. I think you have a hot spring and no idea what you are sitting on. Either way, I intend to go home knowing." I said that was the most honest thing anyone had said to me in a week. She said, "I do not see the advantage in the other kind," and went back to counting baskets. Rel counts aloud. She does it like other people hum. Steps, crates, roof beams, the number of times a man says a particular word in an argument, and if you interrupt the count, she starts again from the beginning and makes you wait through it. The first morning she came out to the north face at second light in kite riding boots, and kite riding boots are not boots for a slope, and she asked which row was hers. Audrey said guests do not pick. Rel said she was not a guest. She was an observer, and an observer who does not touch the crop learns nothing, and she took a basket off the stack while he was still forming the second half of his objection. She picked 140 in the first hour, which is respectable. By the 3rd day, she was doing 310 and had reorganized the drying shed so the carts did not have to turn. And Audrey had started asking her opinion about the sheds, which he has never done to me. She maintained throughout that she was on reconnaissance. She said it with pear sap up to her elbows and a strap mark across her shoulder. She said it in the evening while writing her father a letter that said, "So far nothing." I asked her once what she was going to put in the letter if there really was nothing. She said, "Nothing." I said her father would not like that. She said her father has never once liked anything she has written, and that this has been enormously freeing. Her private objection to my mountain, which she raised 3 times a day, was the north path. It runs from the spring up to the top cut, and it is the only way to move crates off the high rows. She walked it on the second day and came back and said, 1,140. I said, 1,140 what? She said, steps. And it is a disgrace. And if you cut a switchback at the third bend, it is 920. We cut the switchback. It took 4 men 2 days, and it is the single most useful thing that has ever happened to my house, and she has never once let it be a favor. It was a finding. She had found it. She was on reconnaissance. Doha came up the low road on the 4th day of picking with 2 pharaoh men and a surveyor's chain in a bag. He did not come quietly. He came into the lower orchard at the hour when every picker on the hill was in it, 35 people on ladders, and he stood in the aisle and announced that House Pharaoh was exercising its right to resurvey the road easement across Mount Dell. Then he said the good part. He said, and it will be done in the presence of the household, so that no one may later claim it was done in the dark. He wanted them watching. He had brought the chain so that 35 of my people could watch a pharaoh man measure my mountain and understand what was coming. Audrey climbed down off a ladder, wiped his hands, and said, "Will this move the picking dates?" Doha said it would move considerably more than the picking dates. Audrey said that was a shame, because Thursday is Thursday, and went back up the ladder. The hill laughed. It was the first time anybody on my mountain had laughed at a pharaoh man in my lifetime. Doha ran his chain. Rel walked beside him all the way with her counting stick and said the numbers out loud 1 beat before he said them, every single time, for 1,100 paces of road. He asked her to stop. She said she was an observer. He said, "Observers do not speak." She said this one counts. And if he wanted a different observer, he should have brought his own, and asked whether he would like her to start again from the top so he could hear the total. I just more disqualificator. You so where it came apart was at the second boundary stone. The easement runs to the stone and stops. Doha put his chain past it by about 200 paces onto the upper cut. The upper cut is not road and has never been road and has a well on it. Rel said, 480. Doha said, 480 what? She said, 480 paces past the mark, and if you would like, I will say it again louder, because the men at the top of the hill did not hear it the first time. They had heard it. 35 people had come down off their ladders by then and were standing in the aisle in a way that was not threatening and was not moving either. He rolled up the chain. He said the survey was preliminary. Preliminary, Rel said, and wrote it down on her stick with her thumbnail and asked him to spell it. He went back down the low road that evening with his 2 men, past every ladder on the hill, and he did it in silence. And my mother's cousin, who is 61 and has never spoken to a pharaoh in her life, said good afternoon to him, which was the worst thing that happened to him all day. Vaelka came the next evening, and she did not come up the low road. There is a winter path off the Sunder side that comes over the shoulder of my mountain and drops into the top cut, and it is not a path so much as a habit. How Sunder uses it when it does not want to be seen arriving. The pickers saw her first, up at the high rows against the light, one figure coming down through the trees with no escort and no horse, and the entire north face went quiet in about 4 seconds. 35 people, quiet, on a hillside, with their hands still in the branches. She had asked me 2 days earlier whether I would take the low road or the winter path, and I had answered the question as a question, and she had answered it as a plan. She came down the aisle, and everybody moved back and made a lane, and she stopped at the head of it 3 paces from me, which by then had stopped being a distance and become a piece of furniture we both carried around. She said, "Your north face is 4 days early." I said it was. She said, "Your father used to send word when it came early." I said he did, and then I said, "To whom?" She did not answer that. She looked up the hill at the trees for a while, and then she said, "I will stay 2 nights," and went to look at the drying sheds. I gave her the tour. I want that understood. I walked the Warden of the Ridge round my drying sheds and my spring and my sorting tables and explained the difference between a shoulder pair and a keeper, because I had decided she was here about the road. It made sense. Pharaoh had brought a chain onto my land. The warden holds the passes. Roads are her business, and a woman does not cross a mountain in the dark to look at a crate. She let me do it. She stood at the spring in the steam with her gloves on and listened to 11 minutes on drainage and asked 2 questions, and both of the questions were about drainage, and neither of us mentioned the road once. Rel watched that tour from the shed door with her stick in her hand. Afterwards, she said, "One." I said, "One what?" She said, "One question about the road in an hour and a half," and it was mine, and I asked it, and she did not answer it. Kesta arrived at noon the following day on a mule. And Kesta on a mule is a thing I hope to see once more before I die. She got down in my yard, put her hand flat on the wall, told my steward that she had not left the ridge since her mother's burial, and asked whether we had anything that was not pear. I asked her what had brought her. She said, "The warden of the ridge is on this mountain, and I am the master of seniority, and if a number changes on a hillside with no rod in the room, then it did not change. And I will not have it said that the reading was ever guessed at." I said nothing was going to change. Kesta said, "I have been doing this 19 years, and looked at me as you look at a man who has not read the weather." It happened at the sorting tables in the late afternoon, with every one of my people in the yard, because Vaelka does not do anything in private that she means to have hold. She said, "Master of seniority, bring your rod." Kesta had it out of the mule pack before the sentence ended. She laid it on the flags and put the chalk line down and told me to stand where I stand, which by then I could do without thinking. Then Vaelka said, "Toren of Dell, do not move your feet." I did not move my feet. That is all of my contribution to what happened next, and I have never claimed otherwise, and I would like the record to show that the 9th house stood still on purpose and got credit for it for months. She moved. Half a pace is nothing. It is the length of a boot. On a flat yard in the middle of an afternoon, a woman moved the length of a boot toward me, and it was the hardest thing I have ever watched anybody do. She went in stages. She would take a fraction and stop and hold, and her shoulders would come up half an inch and go back down, and she would breathe out through her nose and take another fraction. Twice she went backwards. Nobody in that yard made a sound. My mother's cousin had a crate against her hip for the entire thing and did not put it down. It took her a minute and a half to move half a pace. When she had it, she said, "Master of seniority, measure." Kesta went down on the flags with her rod. She tapped the stone twice with 2 fingers in my yard in front of my people, and she stood up and said, 2 paces and a half. Then Vaelka took the glove off her left hand. Not off. That is not right, and I am going to be exact, because everybody who repeats this gets it wrong. She pulled the first finger of the left glove free, the forefinger, and left the rest of it on, and folded the empty finger down into her palm and closed her hand around it. 1 bare finger. In 11 years, 1 bare finger, in a pear yard, in front of 13 servants, a kite daughter, a master of seniority, and a man who had not moved his feet. She said, "That is where you stand now." Then she said, "Do not close it." I said I had no plans to close anything. She said, "That is why." The yard changed its mind about me before she had reached the steps. Audrey said, "So, 2.5, and asked whether that would move the picking." Rel said, 310. That was her own count for the day, and had nothing to do with anything. Then she said, "Sorry," and then she said, 2.5, out loud, twice, and wrote it on her stick. My mother's cousin put down the crate at last and said, in her own yard, to nobody in particular, that she had washed that girl's father's shirts, meaning mine, meaning me, and that she would like it known she had thought I would come to nothing. Kesta stayed the night and went down at second light with the number, because a number that has not been read in the evening hall has not happened, and she wanted it read before the ridge could hear it as a rumor. She was too late by half a day. The kitchen already had it. Yuna had it on the back of her slate before Kesta's mule reached the gate. The kitchen voted 19-1 that the 9th house had done something clever, and the one holdout was Yuna, who said that I had done absolutely nothing at all, and that this was the interesting half of it. On the road below my lower orchard, that same morning, there were 2 more covered litters coming up, one from House Ossel and one from House Brask, each with a daughter in it, and a letter that said no answer was necessary. By the end of picking week, my house had 9 guests in it, and 14 people to look after them, and 4 of the 14 were over 70. House Ossel sent a daughter with a letter about the pear trade. House Brask sent 2, which I still think was greedy, with a letter about the pear trade. House Kulm sent one with a letter that did not bother mentioning the pear trade and simply said she was fond of hillsides. Every letter ended with the words, "No answer is necessary." I have 9 of them in a box. I take them out sometimes and read the last line of all 9 in a row, and it is still funny. Put them in the orangery, because the orangery is the only room on Mount Dell with a stove that stays in and enough glass to make guests feel they have been given something. The orangery became a parliament inside 4 days. They sat in it in the evenings with the stove going and worked out what I was, and they did it out loud, and the wall between the orangery and the back passage is 1 course of brick. The Ossel daughter held that it was training. Somewhere on this mountain, she said, there is a discipline, and the 9th house has been sitting on it for 4 generations while pretending to grow fruit. One of the Brask sisters held that it was blood. The other Brask sister held that it was the spring, and that the water did something, and she was seen twice at second light filling a flask from it and drinking the flask, which cannot have been pleasant. Rel held that it was a hot spring, a cold face, and a man too slow to run away. And the parliament voted her down every single evening, and she wrote the result on her stick every single evening, and the tally at the end of the season stood at 19-0 against her. She was the only one of them who was right. She was right all the way through, and nobody believed her once, and I have never seen anybody enjoy losing a vote so much. I liked it. I am going to be honest about that and take whatever anybody wants to make of it afterwards. I had spent 22 years as the 9th house, and the 9th house is not a name. It is a position in a queue. That autumn, people started saying Toren in rooms where I was not present. My house had a fire in every grate for the first time since my father, because guests must be warm, and a house that must warm 9 guests warms 14 servants as well. Audrey's mother slept warm for the first winter in 9 years. I am aware that a great many terrible things were coming. I am telling you that the old woman slept warm, because it happened, and because nobody else is going to tell you. The men started arriving in the 2nd week. House Vane sent one first. He was 30, and he had a good sword, and he stood in my yard and said that his house had instructed him to learn the discipline of House Dell, and that he was prepared to serve a term for it. I said, there is no discipline of House Dell. He said he understood, and that discretion was proper, and that he was prepared to serve 2 terms. By the end of the month, there were 6 of them. Vane, Ossel, Brask, 2 from Kulm, and 1 from a Tor cadet line, and they were living in my lower barn and getting up at second light to watch me. Watch me do what? You are entitled to ask. Pick pears, sort pears, argue with Audrey about the hinges on the drying shed, which we still had not replaced. Eat. They took notes. The Vane man kept a book. On the 14th of that month, he wrote down that I had held a crate against my left hip on a slope and had changed hip at the turn, and he underlined it, and then he practiced it in the barn. I found out what they thought they had worked out about a week later, and I found out because they told me, formally in a group, having elected the Vane man to speak. He said, "We have it." I said, "You have what?" He said, "The discipline of House Dell is refusal of advance." He said it exactly like that, refusal of advance. He said the entire art is that you do not close the distance, and that you hold your ground with your hands open, and that this is why the Warden permits it. I said the entire art is that somebody told me there was a line when I was 6, and I have never gone and checked. He wrote that down. He wrote it down word for word and read it back to me to check it and thanked me for it. And that night, the 6 of them chalked a line across my lower barn floor and took turns standing at it, holding still, with their hands open, correcting each other's shoulders. There is a whole autumn of my life in which a chalked line on a barn floor was the most studied object on the ridge, and grown men from 5 houses stood at it in rotation, breathing carefully, and one of them was cutting a notch in the beam for every hour served. And at the end of that autumn, none of them could have told you what they were meant to be doing at the far side of the line, and none of them asked, because asking would have meant admitting they had come up a mountain in winter to learn how to stand still from a man who grows fruit. The ridge took it seriously. That is the piece that still gets me. 2 of the houses started keeping their swords back from the drills in the yard so they could be spared for the barn. Somebody in the low town started selling a chalk that held better on a cold floor. And the number stayed at 2.5 all that time, and the ridge began very slowly to have a thought about it. The thought was this: if the distance is a discipline, and a discipline is teachable, then the distance is not hers. It is a thing that a sufficiently trained man may reduce. and the Ridge, which had spent 11 years being unable to think about the Warden at all, discovered it could think about her in numbers. I did not hear that thought spoken out loud for another 2 months. It was already in the barn by then. Doha came up in the 3rd week to serve papers about the boundary stone, which he did in the yard in 4 minutes, and then he did not go down again for 2 days. He stayed in the low town. He came back up at night. Yuna had it from a pharaoh groom, who had it from himself, because a groom sleeps in the same straw as the man he grooms for, and Doha had begun talking as men talk, when they have decided that the world has made an administrative error concerning them. On the 2nd night, my barn had a visitor. The 6 of them were at the line, doing the rotation, and Doha came in out of the dark with his coat collar up and stood at the back and watched for a while, and then he took his place in the rotation. Nobody stopped him. That is the thing about a chalk line in a barn. It does not check a man's house. He was good at it. He is a genuinely excellent swordsman, and holding still is inside that. And the vain man told me afterwards, with real warmth, that the pharaoh sword had the best shoulders on the line. Came back the 3rd night, and the 4th. And on the 5th night, Kesta arrived on the mountain to take a reading of the household for the seniority table at 2nd light, and came round by the barn because she could hear the notch being cut. She opened the barn door on 7 men standing in a line on a chalk mark in the dark, holding their hands open, and one of them was the sworn sword of House Pharaoh, who had sworn out loud to a yard of 90 people that it had all been a trick of the floor. Kesta did not say anything at all. She looked at it for a while, and then she counted them out loud, 1 to 7, tapping the doorframe twice with 2 fingers, and then she went out and closed the door. She had it in the evening hall 3 days later, not as gossip, as a report delivered by the master of seniority to a full room on the matter of a household count at Mount Dell, in which she named the 7 men present in the lower barn at 2nd light on the 5th night in order by house, ending with the 7th. Doha stood up to explain. He got as far as saying that observation of an enemy discipline is a duty owed by any sworn sword to his house. No se fueron dotes spray fribicas. And Merrick of House Pharaoh, who is Saren's father, and who had been sitting with his hand flat on the table since the night of the banquet, said, "And did you observe it standing on the line, or standing off it?" He had to answer. He said, "On it." And Kesta, who is not a kind woman, said, "For 4 nights," and then read the notches, because she had counted those too. Ave came up the mountain herself in the 4th week, with 2 carts, at an hour of the morning that made it clear she had left the ridge in the dark. She got down and said, 112. I said, 112 what? She said, the number of rooms at Tor. All of them, the house entire, and my father moves to the winter seat, and the road easement is bought out and destroyed in front of every house on the ridge, and you keep your mountain and never come to Tor at all if you do not wish to. I said no. She said, you have not asked what I want in return. I said I had been assuming it was me. She said, it is, and I said no again, and she said quicker that time. Then she offered the seal. She always offers the seal. It comes out on its cord after every refusal, held level, at arm's length, and I have never once taken it, and she has never once looked as if she expected me to. She stayed for the evening meal, because it would have been an insult to send the heiress of the 2nd house back down a mountain in the dark, and my household sat the heiress of the 2nd house at my right hand, because where else do you sit her? Vaelka arrived the following evening by the winter path with no escort as usual, and did not mention it. She did not mention it at the sheds. She did not mention it at the spring. She did not mention it over the meal, at which she sat exactly where she always sits and ate 2 pears and asked Audrey about drainage. 6 days later, at the reading in the evening hall on the ridge, Kesta announced a revision of the seating of the 2nd house on the grounds of a procedural review of the winter table, and moved Maeve of House Tor 4 places along the high table, away from the warden's chair and away from mine. There is no such thing as a procedural review of the winter table. Kesta invented it that afternoon, and when I asked her about it years later, she said, without any expression whatsoever, that the review had been overdue. Maeve took her new place, looked down the table at the gap, and laughed out loud in the evening hall, which had also not happened in living memory. She came and found me afterwards and said, 47. I said, 47 what? She said, the number of paces I have been moved. Then she said, do you understand that she has never done that to anybody? And I said I assumed it was procedure, and Maeve looked at me for a long moment and said, yes, procedure. and walked off making a noise into her sleeve. Kesta redrew the table again that same night. Dell went from 7th to 5th, above Ossel and above Brask, and both of those houses had daughters in my orangery at the time, which made it awkward at a level I could not follow. And then she gave the standing of the Warden of the Ridge, Bendas I Petchu Unterbergrade, and the hall did not put its coats on because the hall had stopped putting its coats on entirely, and 200 people sat in the dark and waited. She said, the Warden of the Ridge stands at 2 paces and a half, and at 2 paces and a half stands Toren of House Dell. Rel was counting in the orangery when the rider brought it up the mountain the next day, and she stopped counting, which she does not do, and said the number out loud twice. Then she said, in the ledger of this house, there are 40 crates a year going down to a factor in the low town under no name at all, and they have been going for 11 years, and I would like to know who eats them. Winter on the Ridge closes 4 of the 9 passes and puts every house that matters into one building for 3 months, which is how the Ridge has always made its worst decisions. House Dell had never gone down for the winter sitting. 5th of 9 goes down, so we packed a cart, and Audrey came, and Rel came because nobody had told her not to, and my mother's cousin came because she wished to see the Ridge before she died and had said so at volume for 4 days. They gave us rooms on the 2nd floor of the West Range with a window each. My father's whole life he slept in the 9th house lodging, which is a corridor with beds in it, and I have never worked out how to think about that, so mostly I do not. Audrey inspected the rooms and reported that the shutters were sound, but the sills wanted linseed, and asked whether being 5th of 9 was likely to affect the spring pruning. I said I did not believe it would. He said good, because the north face wants 2 men on it from the thaw. The line had moved indoors by then. 6 men in a barn had become an institution in an armory, and the armory of the Ridge is a long hall with sand on the floor and 111 blades on the wall, and somebody had chalked a mark across the middle of it. They called it the standing, not the discipline of House Dell, which had been a mouthful, and not refusal of advance, which the vain man had loved and which had lasted about a month. The standing. Men went to the standing as they went to sword drill, and they had made Doha its master, because he had the best shoulders on the line, and because a sworn sword with no house of his own, and 12 years of waiting will take any title that is offered to him by more than 2 people at once. Let me be careful here. It was not a joke to them. The houses had watched a man of the 9th house be measured twice and come out the same twice, and had concluded that something existed which they did not have. And men who conclude that will build an institution around a chalk mark in about 11 weeks. Doha ran it properly. Rotations, postures, a book of attendances, a form of words at the start. I went once because I was asked and I stood at the back, and he did not throw me out, and I would like it on the record that he was better at running it than I would have been. He also could not stop himself, and that is all of him, and it is why the winter went the way it did. On the 4th day of the sitting, the armory was full, 40 men and a good few wives, and everyone of the Culm household who had nothing else to do. And Vaelka came in. She came in because she comes into every room in that building at some point in a day, and because there are 111 blades on that wall, and 11 of them are hers. The armory dropped half a tone. 40 men found the sand very interesting. She walked down the side of the hall to the racks. The mark was chalked across the middle of the floor. She stopped by the racks with her back to the room and looked at a blade she did not take down. And Doha said, "Warden, with your permission, the standing would ask a demonstration. That is the sentence." He had a hall behind him and a title in front of him, and a woman across the sand who had cost him a stool, a survey, a hinge plate, and 4 nights of notches in a beam. She said, "Of what?" He said, "Of the distance." Then he said, "If the 9th house can hold it 2.5, the standing has proved it can be held, and a man who has trained it should hold it also. And House Pharaoh proposes to demonstrate that before the winter sitting." I was at the back. It would be tidy to tell you I said something. I did not say anything. I have thought about that for a long time, and I still do not know what I would have said. She turned round and put her hands behind her and said, "Come then." He came. He came well. He came the way a good swordsman crosses sand, without hurry, with his hands open as the standing taught it, and the hall counted it under its breath the way a hall does. And then he stopped, at 5 paces. Did not decide to. You could see him not deciding to. His front foot came down and stayed down, and the rest of him arrived over it and stopped, and his shoulders were still perfect, and he was 5 paces out and going nowhere. He tried again. He went back to the wall and came in a second time, and he stopped at 4.5. 4.5 is worse than 5, because 4.5 is a man who has bargained with himself on the way in. The third time, he got to 4, and stood there for a while with his hands open, and the hall was completely silent. And then he said, in a voice that did not carry as well as his voice usually carries, that the sand was giving under him. Kesta was in the doorway. Kesta is standing in every doorway in that building. She said, "Shall I fetch the rod?" He said no. She said, "I have it here." He said no. She said, "The challenger will confirm the count." She had said that to him in a yard in front of 90 people in the autumn. She said it in exactly the same tone. There is no cruelty on this ridge to touch the master of seniority when she decides to repeat herself. He said 4. Then, he said it was a matter of the footing. Then he walked out through a hall of 40 men who had come to watch him prove something, and he had to pass the chalk mark to get to the door, and he went round it. Nobody moved for a bit. Then the vain man, who is not clever but is decent, said, "Well," and picked up the book of attendances, and the hall started breathing again. And Vaelka said, across the sand, to a room that was not expecting to be spoken to, that the fault was not in the man and not in the footing, and that anybody in this hall would have stopped where he stopped, and that they should not think less of him for it. Then she looked at the back of the hall where I was standing, and said nothing at all, and went out, and 40 men turned round to see what she had looked at. That was the first time it occurred to me that whatever the barn had been studying, I was not doing it, and neither were they, and that the thing was not a thing you do. It did not go further than occurring to me. I had a winter sitting to get through, and a household in the West Range, and a woman from House Tor sending me a number every 4th day. Occurring to me was as far as I got, and it stayed there for 8 more weeks. Morel brought me the Lowtown in a paper bag, which is her method. She had gone down twice that month with the carts and had come back with counts, and one of the counts was a conversation. She said, 4 fathers, she said, the fathers of the daughters, in the back room of the inn at the Lowtown on the 9th night, and I was in the next room because the wall is 1 course of brick, and I have made a study of walls. I asked what they said. She said, they said the daughters have failed. Not that you refused them, because you have refused nobody. You have simply put them in an orangery and let them get on with it, which they agree is the most infuriating thing you have done. She said, they have worked out that the daughters were the wrong instrument. Harn of House Vane said it plainly. He said the prize is not the boy. The prize is the distance, and the boy is only the proof that the distance moves. I said I did not follow. She said neither did I at first, and then said 1 and held up 1 finger, and said for 11 years the passes were held by a woman nobody would go near, and then said 2 and held up the 2nd finger, and said this winter 40 men are in an armory, learning that going near is a skill. She said 3, and she did not hold up a 3rd finger, and she did not say the 3rd thing, because she had counted far enough to see it, and had decided not to be the one who said it out loud in my room. Una was pouring in the great hall all that winter, and she had gone up a table, which for a wine-bearer is a real thing, and took her 4 years. She poured for the 4th house now. She wanted the high table. She had wanted the high table since she was 11, and had said so to the kitchen approximately 9,000 times, and the kitchen had told her 9,000 times that a Lowtown girl pours the low tables, and that is the end of it. She came and sat on my windowsill in the West Range one night, and told me what the warden had worn for 11 days running, in order, before she told me what she had come to say. Then she said, they have started saying it in the kitchen. I said, saying what? She said that a warden who can be walked up to is a warden who can be walked up to by anybody. I said that was foolish. She said the kitchen is never foolish and is frequently early, and that she wanted it written down that she had brought it to me on the 11th night of the sitting, and she wrote it on the back of her slate with the date, because she writes everything down that way, and always has. Ilna caught me on the stair between the 2nd and 3rd landings. It is the only place in that building where a pharaoh can stand without a pharaoh seeing them. She said, 5 years ago I said mind who pours for you and you. And she stopped, because that is what she does. And I said, and I laughed. And she said yes. I said I was sorry. She said she did not want an apology. She wanted me to do the other thing. And I said, what other thing? And she said, believe me when it happens again. That is all. One time. And then she looked down the stair and said, my sister is going to speak at the sitting. I said Saren speaks constantly. Ilna said, at the sitting, on the road, with our father sitting down. Then she went, because somebody came up and she left me on a landing with the word road. Saren spoke alninkake no at spelling. Then spoken dealt balming by. Then spoken the sitting on the 14th day. House Pharaoh put the road easement before the 9 houses formally. A house may do that once in a generation. Merrick of House Pharaoh put it, and Saren stood up beside her father to give the history. She gave a good history. 13 years of betrothal, a road agreed between 2 houses when both parties were 9 years old, a mountain that has never disputed the easement, a survey conducted in the autumn. Harn of House Vane said, is that the survey that ran 480 paces past the second boundary stone? Saren said that the survey had been preliminary. Then she explained why it had been preliminary, which nobody in that hall had asked her to do. She explained that the sworn sword had been instructed to establish the working extent of the easement rather than the legal extent, because the legal extent was known to be less than the working extent, and that this is common practice. Merrick of House Pharaoh closed his eyes. She was not lying. She has never lied in her life. She was standing in front of the whole ridge, telling the exact truth about what she had told her sworn sword to do, in order to demonstrate that it had been proper, and the 9 houses were writing it down. She would have kept going. Kesta stopped her, which I have always taken as a mercy, by asking what the house sought, and Saren said that the betrothal be honored, or that the mountain be surrendered in compensation. The hall looked at me. This is a thing I had still not got used to, and never did get used to. 200 faces turning at once like a field going over in wind. I stood up. 5th of 9 stands up in that hall. I said, House Dell does not surrender the mountain. Then I sat down, because I had not prepared anything else, and I have never seen the point of pretending. Merrick said, and the betrothal. And I said, ask her, and I meant Saren. And Saren said, in front of 9 houses and her father, that she had no wish to marry me and had not had one since she was 15. And that this was not the point. She is right that it is not the point. She has never once been wrong about the point. She simply cannot stop herself explaining the point until it has fallen apart in her hands. Vaelka did not speak at the sitting and did not attend it, and the pass sends her a rider every day of winter, and everyone in the hall knew both of those things and made their own arrangements with them. She sent for me on the 17th day, and the message said, the high pass, and bring boots. The high pass above the Sunder side is a 3-hour climb in winter, and at the top there is a wall, a gate, a stone barracks, and a view into the country on the other side. It is white and it goes on for a very long way. She was standing on the wall when I came up. She said, that is what I hold. I said I could see that. She said, no, look. And I looked, and there is a road on the far side that comes up out of the white and stops about a mile short of the gate for no reason a road should ever stop. She said, that is where they turn round. I said, who? She said, whoever is coming that year, and they have turned round at that spot for 11 winters. Kesta arrived an hour behind me on the mule, with a folding stool and a boy carrying the rod, in weather, and she got off the mule at the top of a 3-hour climb and said, if it moves on a mountain again, I will resign. It moved on the mountain again. Vaelka came off the wall and stood on the flags of the gate yard, and the pass garrison came out, 42 men and a cook, because a warden standing still in her own gate yard is a thing you come out for. She said, do not move your feet. I said I never do. Then she did it in one movement, and it was fast, and it was over before Kesta had the rod down, and half a pace of ground went away like a card being turned. And then she had to stand with her back to me for a long time, and her right hand was closed so hard the glove creaked, and nobody in that gate yard said one word for the better part of a minute. When she turned round, she said, I have been practicing. I said, practicing what? She said, in the north study, and there is a mark on the boards. I have been walking to it since the yard on your mountain, at night, 400 and some times, and tonight there is no mark, so I am telling you instead. I did not have anything to say to that. I still do not, and I have had years. Kesta measured it. She tapped the flags twice with 2 fingers in a gate yard in front of 42 men and a cook, and she stood up in the wind and said, 2 paces. Then Vaelka pulled the second finger of the left glove free and folded it into her palm with the first, and closed her hand around both, and put that hand behind her back where the garrison could not see it. 2 bare fingers. I counted them, because by then I had become a man who counts things, which is Rel's doing entirely. She said, "That is where you stand now." I said, "Understood." She said, "You do not ask me why I do it." I said, "You have not offered, and I have not earned it, and it is your distance and not mine." She looked at me for a while, and then she said, "Sit down." And we sat on a cold wall above the country where the road stops, and she asked about the north face, and I talked about drainage for 11 minutes, and she let me. The reading in the evening hall 2 nights later said 2 paces, and the hall said it back, and it was the loudest I ever heard it. And then Harn of House Vane stood up in the same hall in the same hour, and asked the Master of Seniority a question that had never been asked in that room. He said, "What does the standing garrison of the High Pass number?" Kesta has every number in that building. She said it because she is the Master of Seniority, and lying is not available to her. She said, 42 men and a cook. 200 people sat in that hall and worked out at the same moment and in silence that for 11 years the northern approach to the ridge had been held by 42 men, a cook, and a rumor about a woman that everybody in the room had just spent the winter learning to walk up to. The standing died in 11 days, and nobody ever announced it, which is how institutions actually end. After the armory, attendance went from 40 to 26 to 9. The vain man kept the book going out of decency for a while, and then stopped writing dates in it. Somebody took the chalk mark up with sand and a broom and did not say who had told them to. What killed it was arithmetic, and the arithmetic was in the room the day Doha stopped at 4. If a trained sword of the 3rd house cannot come inside 4, and the 9th house stands at 2, then the standing is not a discipline that men may learn. It is a thing that is true of one man. And a thing that is true of one man, on a ridge whose northern approach is held by 42 soldiers and a cook, is not a curiosity. It is a hinge, and everybody in that building could feel the door swinging on it. Harn of House Vane said it out loud in the West Range one evening to 4 house heads with the door open, which on the ridge is the same as publishing it. He said, "For 11 years, no army has come up that road because no man alive would go inside 3 paces of her, and now a fruit farmer stands at 2, and we have all watched it measured. What exactly is holding the pass this spring?" Rel heard it through a wall, because Rel has made a study of walls, and brought it up to my room in the same tone she uses for basket counts. She said, 4. I said, 4 what? She said, 4 house heads, 1 open door, and 1 question, and the question was, what holds the pass? Then she sat down on my windowsill and said, "I would like to state for the record that I came here to study fruit." Bachar How. House Pharaoh put the road before the 9 houses for the last time on the 22nd day of the sitting, and I am fairly certain Merrick did not want to. He did it because a house that has raised a matter twice must either close it or withdraw it, and withdrawing it in front of 9 houses would have cost Pharaoh more than his daughter had already cost him, which by then was a considerable amount. Saren stood up beside him and gave the history again. She gives a good history. She has the dates, she has the survey, she has the temper for it, and for about 11 minutes it went well for her. Then Kesta asked the question she had been saving all winter, because Kesta saves questions, and she asked it in the flattest voice in that building. She said, "On the night of the Ascension Banquet, who chose the 9th pour?" Saren said, "I did not choose the wine," which is true. Doha chose the wine, and she said the true thing first, the way she always does, and then she could not leave it there. She explained that the choice of wine was not hers. She explained that she had asked only that the cup be a strong one, because my head is famously poor. She explained that she had said this to the sworn sword privately, and that a private instruction is not a public act. 200 people heard a young woman explain the difference between asking for a strong cup and choosing the wine, and every single one of them understood that she had asked for a strong cup. Merrick of House Pharaoh said, "Saren, just that," her name from her own father, in a hall, and she said, "Father, I am explaining." And he said, "I know." Then Ilna stood up in front of 9 houses. I have thought about this more than anything else that happened that winter. Ilna of House Pharaoh is 19 years old and does not finish sentences when her sister is in the room. and her sister was standing 4 feet away from her, and she stood up in front of 9 houses. She did not have anything in her hands. That is what people get wrong when they tell it. She had left the cup upstairs. She stood up with nothing at all and said, "I have the cup he drank from. I picked it up off the floor of the north corridor, and I have had it since that night, and there is still a 1/4 inch of it in the bottom." She said, "I did not bring it down. If you want it, you may send somebody for it. I am not here to hand anybody a thing. I am here because I said something to Toren of House Dell at the winter market 5 years ago, when I was 14, and he laughed at me, and I have not opened my mouth in a room since." Then she said, "Ask the physician what is in the bottom of it," and she sat down. The hall did not make a sound. Then Harn of House Vane said, "Send for it." They sent for it. A boy went up 2 flights and came back with a cup held in both hands as though it were full to the brim. The physician of the ridge, who is 80 and does not care about houses, put his nose in it in front of 200 people and said one word, and the word was the name of a root that grows in the low town and is used for horses. Audrey, beside me, said that the same root is used on the mountain for a colicked pony, and that it is perfectly good for a pony. I said, "Audrey," he said, "I am only saying it is not poison," which was true, and was the most useful sentence spoken in that hall all evening, and which I am told made the 4th table laugh out loud in the middle of the worst moment of House Pharaoh's century. Merrick did not ask his daughter anything else. He turned around in front of the 9 houses and asked his sworn sword one question. He said, "Did you buy the root?" Doha had been standing behind the Pharaoh table for the entire proceeding with his chin up. He had come in that night as the master of an institution that had been swept off a floor with a broom 11 days earlier, and he had come in anyway, and he had his chin up, and I will say this for him until I die. He said, "I served the house." That is not an answer, and Merrick said so. He said, "That is not an answer," and asked it again, and the hall waited. And Doha said, "Yes." There is a form of words for a house releasing a sworn sword. It is 400 years old, and it is 9 words long, and it is meant to be said at a graveside when a man has served out his life. And Merrick of House Pharaoh said it, standing up in the evening hall with his daughters on either side of him. Then he asked for the badge. Doha unpinned it and put it on the table, and it made a noise on the wood that carried to the back of the hall, and he walked out down the middle of the floor, past every house, in order from the 1st to the 9th. It is the longest walk in that building. Kesta struck the betrothal that night. She said it plainly. A betrothal is a contract between houses in the presence of the 9, and where the cause of its failure is proved against the house that raised it, the claim it carried does not survive it. The road easement across Mount Dell was suspended pending the summer sitting, which is Ridge language for taken away with the form left open. Audrey leaned over to me while the master of seniority was still speaking and asked whether the suspension of the easement would let us finally close the lower gate, since the gate has stood open for 13 years for a road nobody uses. I said I thought it might. He said good, because the deer come through it, and the deer have had 4 rows off us every autumn since my father, and he had been meaning to raise it. Everything I had been dragged into since the banquet had, at that moment, resolved into a closed gate and 4 rows of pears. I want somebody to understand that this is the happiest I had been in 8 months. Hall did the reading afterwards. Dell went from 5th to 3rd, above Vane and above Pharaoh, and Kesta said the words twice for the boys writing it down, and then she gave the standing of the warden, 2 paces, and the hall said it back. I got a message at the end of it, brought by a Sunderman who did not wait for an answer. It said the North Study. I had not been in that room since the night I fell into it. 3 flights up, north side, oak and black iron, maps on the table, and 1 chair and a lamp turned low, and a mark chalked on the boards about 2 paces from where she stood, which she had not swept up. She said, "Sit down." I sat on the floor, because there is 1 chair and she was standing, and because the last time I had been in that room, I had ended up on the floor anyway, and it seemed to be the arrangement. She said, "You are going to hear a thing tonight, and then you are going to go down to your people and think about it. And if you go home in the morning, I will send your carts down with an escort, and nobody on this ridge will say 1 word about it." I said that was a strange way to begin an evening. She said it is the only honest way that I have ever found. Then she told me, and she told it the way a writer tells you the state of a pass. No pauses put in for effect, no looking away at the good bits. She has done 11 years of reports, and it is the only voice she has left for the things that matter. She said, The art of my house is a distance art. There is nothing in it for close work, and there never has been. It goes into the body at 4 years old and stays there. And what the body owns, the mind does not get a vote on. She said, anything that comes inside 3 paces of me is met before I have decided anything about it. Then she said, the meeting is not a decision, and it cannot be made into one. I said, how long can you hold it? She said, between 2 and 4 seconds. Then she said, depending on the day and the weather, and whether I have slept, and whether the thing that came inside was fast. She said, 4 people have come inside it in my life, and all 4 of them died. Then she said, and not one of the 4 was killed by Vaelka of House Sunder, and I have never once got that distinction to mean anything to anybody, including myself. I said, 4. She said it flat, with no pause put in anywhere, and she did not look away from me while she said it. She said, the last one was my husband. His name was Aske. He was of a Sunder cadet line, and she had known him since she was 9, and they had been married 2 years. One morning in the 11th month of that 2nd year, he came into a room behind her while she was at a table with her back to the door, and he was carrying something, and he was pleased about it, and he came fast because he was pleased. She said the whole of that in one breath, and then said, and I was inside 4 seconds, and I did not have them. I did not say anything for a while. Neither did she. Down in the yard, somebody was moving barrels and being told to be quieter about it. Then she said the rest, and the rest is worse. She said, the Ridge decided it was murder. A reason was supplied inside a day, and the reason varied by table. Then she said, I was called before the 9 houses and asked to answer it, and I did not answer it. I asked her why not, and she said, because on the day after they decided I had murdered him, not one person on this ridge came within 6 paces of me, and nobody has died since. She said, I have worn it for 11 years because it works. It is the only wall I have ever built that held. Every autumn some house sends a boy to test whether the warden is really as they say, and the boy stands at 8 paces and shouts something and goes home. And the boy is alive, and he is alive because a hall full of people believe I opened my husband from the collarbone down out of spite. Then she said, that is all of it. You have had the truth about the fence, and you have had the truth about the woman standing behind it, and there is nothing else underneath either of them. And this way sanda and died away, nand ayidishan sai inasam. Understood, sitting on the floor of that room, that for 8 months the entire ridge had believed I was conducting the greatest courtship in the history of the mountain, that 6 men had spent a winter in a barn learning my technique, that a sworn sword had lost a house over it, and that my technique consisted of standing still because somebody had told me the fence was there when I was 6 years old, and that she had known that from the first night, and had let none of it touch her face. I said, so when you locked that door on the night of the banquet, you had already worked every bit of it out. She said, when I locked the door, there were 30 people on a stair coming to ruin you with a thing they had built, and I had the one sentence on this ridge that no room argues with, and I used it. It cost me nothing, and it cost your house nothing, and it ended their evening. That is the practical half, and it is true. I said, and the other half? She said, the other half is that you fell into my room blind on horse route with your legs gone, and you stopped where you were told. 4 people who could see perfectly well have walked into me. You could not see the table. She said, I have watched people cross that line for 11 years, thinking it was a game about me. You are the first one who heard it as a fact about the world. Then she said, and now you know what is on my side of it, so it is not a fact about the world anymore. It is a thing you would be choosing. Go down and think about it. I went down. I did not think about it, particularly. That is not a boast, and to be clear, it is closer to an admission of a defect. I went and stood in the West Range passage for a while, and found that I was not deciding anything, because the shape of it had not changed. Somebody had told me there was a line. The line was still there. The only difference was that I now knew what it cost her to be standing on the far side of it. That is not a reason to move. Rel was on the stairs counting the treads for something. She looked at my face and said, 3. And I said, 3 what? And she said, 3 seconds before you tell me. And then she said, take 4 if you need them. I told her a version. She listened to all of it and said only one thing at the end, which was, so the barn was a barn. I went back up. She was still standing. I do not think she had moved. As Axton Anes, Wovul I said, I am not going home in the morning, and I would like to say why, because you gave me all of yours, and you should have all of mine. I have been standing outside that line since I was 6, Nothing you told me tonight was an argument for standing anywhere else. She said, that is not a reason. I said, it is the only one I have, and I have never had a better one than being told. She said, and if I ask you to stand nearer, I said, then I will stand where you tell me to stand, and not one step further in, and if you tell me back, I go back. That is the entire arrangement, and I am not capable of any other one. She was quiet a long time. Then she said, wake the master of seniority. Kesta came up 3 flights at the 11th hour of the night, in a nightgown with a coat over it, holding the rod, in a temper that I would describe as historic, and she said the following words on the landing, which the entire West Range heard. She said, it is a distance. It will still be a distance at second light. Measure it, Vaelka said. Kesta said, at this hour it will go in the book as an irregular reading. Vaelka said, put it in the book however you like. Kesta went into the north study, looked at the two of them, said nothing at all for a moment, and then knelt down on the boards in her nightgown and laid the rod out. Vaelka moved, not half a pace, a full one, and she did it slowly, and it took a long time, and twice her right hand came up in front of her, and she put it down again by force. Kesta tapped the boards twice with 2 fingers. She stood up and said, 1 pace. Then she wrote it in the book on the table, and under it she wrote the hour, and under that she wrote the word irregular, and she underlined it, because she is who she is. Vaelka pulled the 3rd finger of the left glove free and folded it down into her palm with the other 2. 9 houses had a reading the next evening, and I have never heard that hall make the noise it made. Kesta said, the warden of the ridge stands at 1 pace, and 200 people said it back, and then kept saying it. That is not in the form and has never been in the form. Una poured at the 3rd table that night and came and found me after with her slate and said, look, and turned it over, and the back of it had 1 line on it in chalk with the date, and the line was 1 pace, and under it she had written the count of every reading since the banquet, all of them, in order from 3. I said she had been keeping that since the first night. She said she had been keeping it since 4 years before the first night. She said this was simply where it got interesting. And could I please arrange for her to pour at the high table before the end of it, since she had earned it approximately 9,000 times. They were all in that hall, Vaelka at the head, 1 pace from a chair that had my house on it, Una at the 3rd table with a jug against her hip and a slate under her arm, Kesta at the head with the rod and a book with the word irregular in it, Rel on the kite bench counting the noise. May 4 places along the high table, exactly where a procedural review had put her, sitting sideways to watch me. Ilna of House Pharaoh, at a table that had lost its road, its sworn sword and most of it standing, sitting up straight for the first time in 5 years, because somebody had finally sent for the cup. At the end of the reading, a Sunder rider came into the hall in riding clothes, which is not done, and went the length of the floor to the warden, and gave her a thing said out loud rather than written. That is how the pass reports. He said, Warden, there are people on the far road. She said, how many? He said, we cannot count them yet, and they have not turned round. The pass reported every day that spring, and I heard the reports as everybody else did. A rider came into the hall in riding clothes and said a number out loud and went away again. The first number was 200. The second, 4 days later, was 600. The one after that was not a number at all, because the rider said that the far road now had smoke on it at night in 3 places, and that you cannot count smoke. What nobody said out loud for a fortnight, and what every single person in that building was carrying around, was that the far road has had nothing on it for 11 years. Audrey took the news at the breakfast table and asked whether it would be safe to send 2 men up to the north face for the spring pruning, and I said I thought the north face was a long way from the far road, and he said good, and that was the end of his interest in the matter. Let the record show that he was correct. The north face is a long way from the far road. He was the only person on that mountain who got the geography right all spring. The Council of 9 had last sat 6 years earlier over a dispute about where a Culm cousin should be buried, and it took 11 days and produced a document that nobody has read. It is not a court. That is the thing outsiders always get wrong about the ridge. It is 9 house heads in a round room with no table, sitting on 9 stools of the same height, and whatever they say at the end of it is what the ridge does. They summoned it on the 9th day of spring. Kesta carried the summons round herself because the master of seniority carries summonses, and she came to my rooms in the West Range last, which I understood and did not enjoy. She said, 3rd house. I said, 3rd house. She said, "It means you sit outside the door and you go in when you are sent for, and you will be sent for. And you should think between now and then about what you are going to say when you are." I said I had no idea at all what I was going to say. She said, "That has worked for you so far," and went out. Esther stood outside that room for all of the first day, because she keeps the roll of who spoke and in what order, and she told me afterwards what was said in it. I am giving it to you as she gave it to me. Flat and in order, and with nothing left in for comfort. Harn of House Vane spoke first and spoke well, and what he said was this: "For 11 years, no force has come up the far road, not because we hold it. We hold it with 42 men and a cook, and we have all known that for 11 years, and none of us has ever said it in a room." He said, "It is held because on the other side of that white country, they have been told there is a woman here who kills anything that comes within 3 paces of her, and because for 11 years, no living man has been able to show that this is not true." Then he said the sentence Kesta wrote down, word for word, and she wrote it down because she is the master of seniority, and it is her office to know exactly when a thing changed. He said, "And this winter we measured her down to 1 pace in front of 200 people, and we said the number out loud every evening, and the kitchens carried it to the low town, and the low town carries everything over the pass by summer." Loth of House Ossel said, "Does one man in this room seriously believe she is less dangerous than she was in the autumn?" Harn said, "No." And then he said the second thing. "The second thing is worse than the first, and I have still not found the answer to it." He said, "It does not matter what she is. It matters what they think she is. And what they think she is has a number on it now, and the number is going down." Eric of House Pharaoh, who had lost a road, a sworn sword, and most of his standing that winter, and who owed me nothing, said that the Ridge had spent 11 years living off a lie about a woman, and might consider whether it was entitled to be angry that the lie was wearing out. Kesta said the room went quiet for a while after that. Then it went on anyway, because rooms always do. By the end of the first day, they had a position, and the position had 2 halves, and the 2 halves do not fit together. Everything that came after took its shape from that. The first half was that the pass must be reinforced by every house, at once in strength. The second half was that the standing of the Warden of the Ridge had ceased to be a private matter and would from that day be entered in the muster roll. Doha came back up from the low town on the 11th day of spring, and he came back to the evening hall, because it is the one room on the ridge that a man may walk into without being asked. Yanar. He had been down there since the night he put the badge on the table. Yuna had it from a low town carter, who had it from an innkeeper, and what the innkeeper said was that the man had not drunk, had not fought, and had sat in the same chair for 6 weeks like something waiting for a letter. He came in at the reading and stood at the back with his chin up. He had no house badge on him. He had put on a good coat, which is somehow the detail that gets me, because a man who has decided he is finished does not brush a coat. Kesta read the houses. She got to the 9th and stopped and looked at the back of the hall, and 200 people turned round. She said, "There is no place on this table for a man without a house, and I will not invent one." Then she said, "You may stand," and she went on with the reading. And he stood at the back of that hall through every minute of it with nothing to be and nowhere to sit. It would be tidy to say I felt nothing about that. I felt something about it, and I am not going to pretend otherwise, and it did not last, and by the following evening it had been thoroughly cured. Because the council sent for him the next morning. They needed exactly what he was. A council of 9 house heads cannot demand proof of a 10th party without one of the 9 being seen to demand it. And every house on that ridge had spent the winter learning why nobody wants to be the house that asked. So they revived an office that had last been used before my grandfather, and the office is called The Voice, and The Voice has no house and no land and no vote. The Voice asks the questions the council does not wish to be seen asking, and any house on the ridge must answer it. They gave it to a masterless sword who had spent 6 weeks in a chair in the low town, and he took it, and I have never been able to decide whether that was cruel of them or simply efficient. He came into the evening hall that night with a black cord on his shoulder instead of a badge. Kesta, who had told him the night before that there was no place for him, stopped the reading and put down the roll. She gave him the seat at the head of the 9th table, because that is where the Voice sits, and because she is the master of seniority, and the table is the table. He sat down and looked up the length of that hall to the high table where I was, third house, and he did the thing he does. His chin came up. Dave sent me a number the following morning, and it was the best one she ever sent me in her life. She said, 9. I said, 9 what? She said, 9 votes. She said, House Tour cannot buy the council, but House Tour has 9 years of favors out on the ridge and can carry 6 of the 9, and would carry them for a man who married into Tour, and that this is the first offer she has ever made me that is worth anything. I said no. She said, this time say why. And I said, a woman who has held a pass for 11 years is not going to be defended by 6 votes I bought for her from a house she never asked. Maeve was quiet for a moment. Correct, she said, and put the seal back inside her coat. Then she said, 61. I said, 61 what? She said, the number of times I have offered you something. Said that seemed high. She said she had been counting since the first morning in the passage, and that Rel of Housekite had been counting too, and that their totals agreed, which frightened them both. Vaelka went up to the high pass on the 12th day of spring and did not come down again, and the hall below her went on reading the houses without her. She had a reason, and the reason was good. There were 600 people on a road on the far side of a wall held by 42 men and a cook, and the warden belongs at the wall. Nobody in that building could argue with it, and everybody in that building felt it as an answer. And on the first evening she was gone, Kesta came to the head of the hall, read the 9 houses, and then stopped. Somebody at the 4th table said, the standing. Kesta said, I have not measured it. The man said it is 1 pace. Everybody knows it is 1 pace. And Kesta said, then he may say it, and he may put his name to it, and I will write his name beside it in the book. Nobody put a name to it. 200 people sat in that hall and could not produce 1 person willing to state a distance they had not seen measured, and the reading ended without the second half of it for the first time since the table was drawn. It went 11 nights like that. Una kept the count on the back of her slate as she keeps everything. 11 marks in a row with no number beside any of them, and she showed it to me on the 9th night and said, that is what it looked like before you. I said it had looked like this for 11 years, and nobody had minded. She said nobody minded because there was a number in it. Now there is a hole in it where the number goes, and a hall notices a hole. I went up on the 13th night. It was my own idea, and it was not a good one. The climb takes 3 hours, and I did it in the dark and arrived at the gate having thought of nothing at all to say. She was on the wall. She is always on the wall. She said, the smoke is in 5 places now. I said, is that many? She said, an army would already have come. That is the front of one, deciding whether to become one. I said, then it comes down to what they have heard about you. Yes, she said. I said, and what they have heard is read out every evening in a hall with 200 people in it and a kitchen underneath it. Yes, she said. And she said, sit down, and we sat on the cold wall above the country where the road stops. And she said, ask me the question you climbed 3 hours to ask. I sake kaidein frein, as fi naisen. On a certain minded, are you going to put the gloves back on and go back to 3 and let them all be frightened of you again? She was quiet a long time. Then she said, I have thought about very little else for a month. Then she said, and I find that I would rather hold this pass with 42 men and a cook than hold it with a rumor about my husband. I did not have anything to add to that, so I told her about the north face, and she let me, and I got about 9 minutes on pruning before she stopped me and said, come down at second light. They will send for you. They sent for me. Third house sits outside the door and goes in when it is called, and I went in and stood on the floor of a round room with 9 stools in it, and 9 house heads on them, and a man with a black cord standing at the wall behind me. Arn of House Vane asked me 3 questions, and every one of them was fair. He said, has the warden ever ordered you to stand nearer? I said, she has never ordered me anything, my lord. She moves, and she tells me not to move my feet. He said, will you swear that no other man on this ridge could stand where you stand? I said, I will not swear it, because I have no idea what any other man can do. And they tried it in an armory all winter, and the best of them stopped at 4. Everybody on those stools had heard about the armory. Then he asked the third one, and the third one was what they had brought me in for. He said, can the number be put up again? Sent back to 3, read at 3, left at 3, and the winter forgotten entirely. Stain and cheese Alarbian, I said, my lord. That is not mine to answer. The distance is hers and has always been hers, and I have never once moved it. If the council wishes to know whether she will go back to 3, the council can climb 3 hours and ask her. Voice spoke from the wall behind me. He said, or the council may simply enter what is true. He said it well. He has always spoken well, and he had a black cord on his shoulder and 9 house heads listening. And for the first time since a corridor in the autumn, he was standing in a room where the card was not going to turn over. Asitat. And they did it. The Council of 9 directed that the standing of the warden be measured, entered and read as a figure of the defense of the ridge in the muster roll, alongside the garrison of the high pass and the count of horses. Kesta read it that night, and she read it twice, which had never been done. She read it once from the seniority book, where it had lived for 140 years, and she said, "The warden of the ridge stands at 1 pace, and at 1 pace stands Toren of House Dell." Then she opened the other book, the muster, in which nothing has ever been written, that is not a wall, a weapon, or a man, and she read it again in the flat voice she keeps for numbers, and the hall did not say it back, because you do not say a muster figure back. And the council directed the reinforcement of the high pass by every house of the ridge, 400 men, to be at the wall in 9 days, which meant that in 9 days the loneliest place in the world was going to have 400 strangers standing in it. 400 men came up to the high pass in 9 days, and nobody on the ridge had thought about where they were going to stand. The wall has a gate yard the size of a large barn. It has a stone barracks that sleeps 42, and a cookhouse built for 1 cook. It has 1 well, and it has, at the middle of all of it, a woman who cannot have anything come inside a measured distance of her without that thing dying. Kesta arrived on the 2nd day with 2 boys, 4 rolls of cord and the rod, and she looked at that yard for about 11 minutes without speaking, and then she said, "I have seated 9 houses at a feast for 19 years, and I have never once had to seat a hillside." She chalked it. She chalked the entire yard, and then she chalked the barracks floor, and then she went out and chalked the road for 200 paces below the gate, and she did it with a rule and a cord, and a boy walking behind her carrying a bucket. And because the distance had gone into the muster roll, the chalk was not a courtesy. Inaugustainas estieste. It was a defense work. Kesta of the seniority table spent that spring drawing the fortifications of the high pass with a lump of chalk on a string, and I have never seen anybody happier. The trouble was the reference. A chalk line has to start somewhere. Kesta will not measure a distance off a person who is moving, and Vaelka moves, because she is the warden and she goes where the wall wants her. So, they used me. I am not going to dress that up. For 6 weeks in the spring, my occupation was standing in a yard at the place where Vaelka of House Sunder was, so that the master of seniority could draw a line round the pair of us, and 400 men would know where the ground stopped. Rel had a word for it inside a day. She called it the marker. She said, "The marker is going up the yard, get out of the way," and 400 grown men learned it in about a week, and after that nobody called me anything else. I did try to object once. I said to Kesta that a man is not a survey point. She said, "A man is an excellent survey point. He complains, but he does not move." And she wrote the word marker in the muster book in her own hand. The voice came up on the 4th day with the black cord on his shoulder and a paper from the council, and he did the job he had been given, and he did it exactly as anybody who knew him would have said he would. He stood in the gate yard in front of the officers of 4 houses, and he read that the standing of the warden was now a figure of the defense of the ridge, and that such a figure is verified at the wall, in the presence of the muster, at first light. Daily. Daily, that was his. The council had not said daily. The council had said entered and read, and the voice may determine the manner, and he determined it in a yard in front of 400 men who had been told all their lives that the warden could not be looked at directly. I fiend thy stides. Waigawai will give him this. It was the correct move, and it was cleverly chosen. If the number went up, he was the man who had restored the fence, and if the number stayed the same, he was the man who had made it a fact of war instead of a piece of gossip about a woman. What he had not considered, because he has never once in his life considered it, is that the number belongs to her. The first verification was at first light on the 5th day, and by first light on the 5th day, every man in that yard knew it was happening, and the ones on the wall came down off the wall. Kesta laid the cord. I stood where I always stood. Vaelka came out of the barracks door with her gloves on, and the yard went half a tone down all the way to the road, 400 men, in the open, in the cold. The voice said the form of words. He said, Warden of the Ridge, the muster of the 9 houses asks the standing. And she said, before you measure it, I am moving it, and I would like the master of seniority to have her cord ready. And she set it to a yard, not to him. She moved. It was not half a pace this time. She went from 1 pace to arm's length in a single crossing, and it took her a long time, and she stopped twice. And the second time she stopped, she turned her head away from me and stood with her jaw set, for a count I did not make, because I was busy not moving my feet. Then she was close enough that I could see the stitching on the wrist of her glove, and she said, do not lift your hand, and I said, I never do. Kesta went down on the flags. There was no need for the cord anymore, and everybody could see that, and she used it anyway, because it was a muster figure, and a muster figure is measured. She stood up and gave it to 400 men. She said, arm's length. Then, because it was going in the muster, and the muster does not take a phrase, she said it again in the other form. She said, 1/2 pace, and the warden stands at 1/2 pace. 400 men said it back. They should not have. A muster does not answer a figure, and they did it anyway, all the way down the road to the second chalk line, and somebody on the wall said it a beat late and got laughed at by the entire hillside. And the voice stood in the middle of that yard, holding a paper from the Council of 9, which said that this number was now a matter of the defense of the ridge, and had to stand there while the defense of the ridge went down by 1/2 pace in front of him, because a woman had decided it would. He had asked for it daily. He got it daily. He had built an instrument for measuring her decline, and she had picked it up and used it to say the opposite thing every morning at first light for the rest of the spring, and he could not put it down, because he had read it out himself in front of 4 houses. Rel said afterwards that this was the finest thing she had ever watched a person do to another person, and she said it while writing the figure on her stick, and she has every one of them on it, every morning of that spring, in her own notching, and she gave it to me years later. Vaelka took the 3rd and 4th fingers of the left glove off in the barracks doorway, with her back to the yard. She did not do that one in public. I saw it because I was standing where the chalk said I stood and the doorway was in front of me. That left her thumb and the last finger, which meant that when she put her hand behind her back the way she does, most of it was skin, and she had to think about where her hand was, in a way she had not had to think about for 11 years. Rel came up to the pass on the 9th day of that arrangement, with a ledger under her arm and mud to the knee, having walked it, having counted it, 1,960 steps from the last chalk line to the gate. Thus, the Trisende, she had not let it go. She had been carrying it since the autumn. 40 crates a year off Mount Dell, going down to a factor in the low town under no name, for 11 years, paid for at the top of the market, and no Dell has ever known who ate them. She walked into that gate yard and passed the officers of 4 houses, and she said, Warden, I am Rel of House Kite, and I have a question about fruit. For the record, I tried to stop this. I got as far as her elbow. She took her elbow back and said, 400 men are standing in a yard about a rumor concerning this woman, and I have a ledger about a different one, and mine has numbers in it. Vaelka said, ask. Rel said, 40 crates a year, 11 years, a factor in the low town with no name on him, top of the market every autumn, and the 9th house never told who is eating 440 crates of its own fruit. And Vaelka said, me. She said it flat, in a yard in front of the officers of 4 houses, and then she said the rest of it, and I have thought about that answer more than almost anything else anybody has ever said to me. She said, after my husband, I could not be in rooms. She said that for about a year, the only place she could stand was the shoulder of a particular mountain where the wind comes off the cold face, and that she walked it in the dark most nights of that year, and that the orchard is on it. She said, the smell of that orchard in the autumn is the only thing in 11 years that has ever made me hungry, and I was not going to steal fruit off a house that has 14 servants and 1 mountain, so I found a factor, and I paid the top of the market, and I never gave him my name. Rel wrote it in her ledger. She wrote it standing up with the book against her forearm, and then she closed it and said, thank you. And then she said the price was too low, which is what I had been about to say, and which I have never forgiven her for saying first. Vaelka said, I know it was too low. I have known since the 4th year, And then she said, if I had paid what it was worth, somebody at Dell would have come down to the low town to find out who was paying it, and looked at me for a moment longer than she needed to, and went back to the wall. The muster feast was Kesta's idea, and she brought it forward as procedure, because on this ridge procedure is how you get a thing that anybody actually wants. She said, 400 men have been at this wall for a month and have not been fed by the houses that sent them, and a muster that is not fed by its houses is a garrison. And I am not putting the word garrison in that book. She had a form for it from 160 years ago. She had had the form for weeks. One table. That is what a muster feast is, and the form is very clear about it, because the point of it is that the houses do not sit as houses. It is set in the gate yard, along the length of it, and every man of the muster and every head of the 9 sits at it, and the warden of the pass sits at the head. I watched her read the form. She read it twice. Then she said, 1 table. And Kesta said, 1 table, warden, it is in the form. And she said, and where does the chalk go? Kesta said, there is no chalk at a muster feast. It is not in the form. And nobody said anything for a while. She agreed to it on the 2nd day. She did not say why, and I did not ask, because I already knew, and because she had told me once on a wall in the winter and had never mentioned it again. She wants to sit at a full table, not to be forgiven for anything, and not to be loved in front of people. She wants to be in a crowded room and not be the empty place in the middle of it. And she has wanted it since before I was born, and it is the only thing I have ever heard her ask for. Yuna came up from the ridge with the wine carts and found me in the yard and told me what the officers of House Brask were wearing before she told me anything else. And then she said, high table. I said, what? She said, high table. Kesta has put me on the high pour for the muster feast. There is no high table at a muster feast. There is 1 table, and the head of it is a warden, and I am pouring at it. She had waited 8 years for that. She said, I have poured at every table on this ridge from the 9th up, and there was 1 left, and now there is none. And then she said, do you know what I am going to do about it? And I said no, and she said, nothing. I am going to pour, and I am going to be extremely good at it. Then she got out the slate and turned it over and showed me the back, and the entire run was on it. 3, 2.5, 2, 1 arm's length, every reading since the first night with the date beside it in her own chalk in a column. I said she should keep that. She said she intended to. She said, when I am old, this will be worth more than the front of it. And the front of it is the wine of the ridge for 11 years. They set the table in the gate yard on the last evening of spring. It took all day. 400 men, 9 househeads, 1 board running the length of the yard on trestles, and the head of it against the barracks wall where the warden sits. Nobody in that yard thought about it, and I have gone over it a great many times since, and it would be a comfort to tell you that I saw it coming. I did not. Neither did Kesta, who has seated rooms for 19 years, and neither did she. The chalk had been up for 6 weeks. The chalk had been the defense of the ridge. The master of seniority washed it off the flags of the gate yard herself on the last afternoon, with 2 boys and a bucket, because the form does not allow it, and everybody watched her do it and thought it was a good thing to be watching. The muster feast started badly, because 400 men who have been told all their lives that a woman cannot be approached do not sit down easily at a board with her at the head of it. The first quarter of an hour was the worst dinner I have ever attended. Men eating with their elbows in and their eyes down. A yard with 400 people in it and no noise except cutlery. Kesta at the middle of the board looking like a woman watching a roof go. What broke it was Audrey, and I have never been able to establish whether he did it on purpose, and I have asked him 4 times, and 4 times he has told me about the pruning. He was down the board about 11 places, and he leaned out and said, across 2 houses and a warden, whether anybody at the wall knew if the frost had held on the far side, because if it had held on the far side, it would have held on our north face, and the picking would come early again. Vaelka said, it held. Audrey said, you saw it hold. She said, I have watched that road every morning for 11 years, and the white on it went in the 3rd week, and the trees on the far side came on 8 days early. And Audrey said, good, and went back to his plate entirely satisfied. 400 men had just heard the warden of the ridge give a fruit report to a steward, and something in that yard came unstuck, and it never went back. Kesta had seated them by who was glad of whom, which is against every rule she has ever kept, and which she has wanted to do since she was 22 years old. There are no houses at a muster feast. That is all of the form. So she had spent 4 days walking that yard, asking men who they would sit beside if they could, and writing it down. She built a board out of it, and the result was 400 men sitting next to the people they actually liked, for the first and only time in the history of the ridge. The noise came up in stages. Cutlery, then talking across the board, then somebody at the far end shouting a thing at somebody at the near end, which is the point at which a yard becomes a room. Yuna poured at the head. She had waited 8 years for that, and she did it perfectly. And she poured for the warden, and for the heads of 9 houses, and for a calm man who had never in his life been poured for by anybody. And she told me afterwards exactly what every one of them was wearing. Maeve came down the board with a cup in her hand and said, "One." I said, "One what?" She said, "One table." Then she said, "I have nothing to offer you tonight. I have looked at this, and I have nothing." And she went away and sat down and was quite unbearably pleased with herself about it. Ilna had come up with the pharaoh carts. She sat about 9 places down on the same side, and she talked for 2 hours without stopping to a stranger in a full yard. And her sister was not there, and I do not think there is anything else I need to tell you about Ilna of House Pharaoh. Rel counted the yard 4 times during the evening and got a different answer each time, which she reported to me as a personal insult, and then she gave up counting, which I had never seen her do, and put the stick in her boot and ate. And I want to tell you about the head of that table, because I was 3 places down it, and I watched all of it, and it is the reason I am telling you any of this at all. She sat in a chair with people on both sides of her. There was a gap at her right and a gap at her left, because nobody in that yard was going to sit at her elbow, and the gaps were about 1.5 paces, and she sat between them for 4 hours with her hands in her lap and a bare thumb and 1 bare finger showing on the left one, and she did not once put her hands behind her back. She watched a yard full of men shout at each other over her head about frost and horses and a road on the far side with smoke on it. About halfway through the evening, she stopped holding her shoulders as she holds them. I had never seen her shoulders down in my life, and I would have paid for that evening with anything I owned. At the end of the 4th hour, somebody started a song. It was a Lowtown song about a carter, and it has about 9 verses, and every one of them is worse than the one before it, and 400 men know all 9. By the 4th verse, they were standing. By the 6th, the men who had been at the low end of the board had come up the yard so they could hear the ones who knew the words, and the men on the wall had come down off the wall, and the yard was not a table with people at it anymore. It was a crowd with a table in it. There was no chalk on those flags. It had been washed off that afternoon with 2 boys and a bucket in front of everybody because it is not in the form. I was standing at the near edge of the gap on her left, 1.5 paces off her chair, because the gap was the one piece of that yard nobody else would stand in, and I had spent 6 weeks being the man who stands where the chalk says. The man behind me was a brass carter of about my age, called Fen, and Fen was singing the 7th verse with his head back and both arms round the shoulders of the men on either side of him. And one of those men stepped back onto a trestle foot. The trestle went, and it went about a hand's width, and a hand's width is nothing. The board came off it, and the board coming off it put 140 pounds of oak into the back of 3 men, and the 3 men came forward. Fen came forward into me. I was not pushed. I want to be exact about this because it has been told wrong all over the ridge for years. Nobody shoved me. A board fell and a man arrived against my back, and I went forward 2 steps the way anybody goes forward 2 steps. 2 steps from 1.5 paces is nothing at all. It was well inside arm's length, and it went inside fast. And fast is the one thing she had told me she cannot hold. I have gone over what happened next about 1,000 times, and I can give it to you in pieces, but I cannot give it to you in order because it did not arrive in order. She was up, not standing up, out of a chair, with the chair going over behind her, and her weight already through her front foot, and her left arm out at full length with the hand open and flat, and it was the fastest thing I have ever seen, and it was not a decision, and I could see that it was not a decision. And she said 1 word. Back, she said. I went back 1 step. That is all I did. I have been given a lot of credit for it since, and there is no credit in it. Somebody said a word, and I did the thing the word said, exactly as far as the word said, and not to the left. Left is where a man goes when he is frightened, and left would have taken me across her. Her hand went through the place where my throat had been, and it kept going, and it took a piece out of the barracks doorpost behind me about the width of a hand. Oak. A doorpost that has held that door since before the wars. There is a mark in it, and you can put your fingers in the mark, and I have done it, and I do not recommend it. Then it was over, and 400 men were standing in a gate yard in complete silence, with the 7th verse of a Carter song hanging in the air above them, and a woman was standing in front of an overturned chair, with her left hand still out. She did not look at me. I need that understood, because everybody asks. She did not look at me once. She looked at her own hand, at the end of her own arm, out in the air in front of her, and she stood there and looked at it for about 4 seconds. Then she put it down, and she walked to the barracks door, past the mark, and she went in, and she shut the door, and the yard heard the bolt go. Fen was on his knees behind me, being sick. The brass officer got him up. Somebody set the trestle back, and somebody else lifted the board and put it on, and men started, very quietly, picking up cups off the flags, because that is what people do. Esta went and got the rod. Nobody asked her to. The voice was in that yard, and the voice said nothing at all, and I will give him that for the rest of my life, because he had 400 witnesses and a paper from the council, and he did not open his mouth. She went to the barracks door, and she knocked on it, and she said, "Warden, I am the master of seniority, and I have a figure to take, and I will take it now, or I will take it at first light, and I would rather take it now." It was a while before the bolt went back. When it did, Vaelka came out into the yard with both gloves on, all the way on, thumb and 4 fingers on each hand, and she came out to the middle of the flags and stood there. "Take it," she said. I stood where I was told. Kesta laid the rod down on the flags of that gate yard in front of 400 men, and she measured it, and she tapped the stone twice with 2 fingers, and she got up. She said, 3 paces. She said it flat, and her voice went the length of that yard, and nobody said it back, and I have been in a lot of quiet rooms, and there has never been anything like the quiet in that one. Then Vaelka said, "Enter it in the muster," and Kesta said, "Warden," and Vaelka said, "It is a figure of the defense, enter it." And Kesta took out the book and entered it standing up in the yard by lamplight. They read it at the ridge 2 nights later in the evening hall, because a muster figure is read at the wall and in the hall both, and I went down for it, and I have never worked out why. Kesta read the 9 houses. Then she read the standing of the Warden of the Ridge from the seniority book, and she said, 3 paces. And 200 people said it back. That is the thing I cannot get past even now. They were not being cruel. It is in the form. You answer the reading without deciding to, and they have done it since they were children. They did it without thinking, and it came back off that ceiling in 200 voices, 3 paces, exactly the way it had come back on the night in the corridor when it had meant the opposite thing. Kitchen did not vote that night. Yuna wrote the number on the back of her slate with the date beside it, and put a line under the column, and then she turned the slate over and did the wine. I went up to the pass at second light the next morning, and the gate was shut, which it is not, and a sunderman came out to me on the road and said the warden was at the wall, and had left word that House Dell was released of any obligation arising from the Ascension banquet, and might go home. And I said I would wait. He said there was no instruction about waiting. I said there was no instruction against it either, and I sat down on a stone below where the second chalk line had been, because they had washed the chalk off the road too. And on the 4th day of that, the Council of 9 was summoned for the 2nd time in one spring, on the motion of the voice. He now had 400 witnesses to a warden who had come within a hand's width of killing a man of the 3rd house at her own table, and he no longer had to argue that the ridge had a problem, because everybody on the ridge had watched one. I sat on that stone below the gate for 4 days, and I would like to be clear that this was not devotion. It was that nobody had told me to go anywhere, and I have never in my life been good at moving without being told. Audrey came up on the 2nd day with a cart, having decided on his own authority that if the head of House Dell was going to live on a road, then the road would want blankets, a brazier, and a man who knew how to work a brazier. He set it all up beside me. Then he sat down and asked whether I had any view on whether we should take the deer fence along the closed gate this year or leave it, since the gate had been shut since the spring, and the deer had not yet noticed. I said I had no view. He said he would take it along. We sat there for a while, and a sunderman came out twice to look at us, and went back in twice without saying anything at all. On the 4th day, the same man came down the road and said, "The warden asks whether House Dell requires an escort home," and I understood what that was, and I got up. It would sound better if I had stood on that road and said something. What I said was that we would not require an escort, and thank her, and that the frost had held. He wrote none of that down. The orangery emptied over the following fortnight, one letter at a time, and I have kept all of those as well. House Ossel wrote first, and the letter regretted that the daughter of House Ossel was required at home for the summer sitting. House Brask sent for both of theirs in the same paper and did not give a reason. House Colm's girl, who was fond of hillsides, cried in my yard and then went. That was worse than the ones who did not. They all closed on the same sentence they had arrived with. No answer is necessary. I have the lot of them in a box, 9 coming and 8 going, and the joke is on the outside of it, and the joke is not funny from inside. The 9th stayed. Rel of House Kite got a letter that instructed her to return to Kite for the summer sitting, read it at my sorting table, put it in her coat, and asked whether the switchback was holding on the 3rd bend. I said her father had sent for her. She said her father had sent for her 4 times since the autumn, and that this was the 4th. I said that at some point a house calls its daughter home and the daughter goes. She said, yes, at some point. Then she said, 1,140. I said that path is 920 now. She said, I know, I cut it, and I will not be at Kite when somebody who has not walked it decides what it is worth. She wrote her father that night, and I saw the letter, because she left it open on the table on purpose, and all of it said, so far, nothing. Ridge takes things off you in an orderly fashion, and it does it through the seniority table, and Kesta came up the low road herself to do it, which she did not have to. She could have sent it. She came up on the mule for the 3rd time in a year, and she stood in my yard, and she said, 3rd house, and then she said, I am here to tell you before I read it, because you should not learn it off a boy. She said, the standing of House Dell was raised on a measured distance. The distance has been struck and read at 3. A table that is honest going up is honest coming down. I said, to what? She said, 5th. Then she said, and if you ask me whether I like doing it, I will tell you that in 19 years, I have redrawn that table 41 times, and this is the 2nd one I have not liked. And I will not be telling you what the first was. She had her tea, and she got back on the mule, and she went down and read it that evening, and House Dell went from 3rd to 5th in a full hall, and there is nothing in the form that allows the hall to say anything about it, so nobody did. I started walking up to the top cut in the evenings. I am going to put this down plainly, because it sounds like more than it was. The winter path comes over the shoulder of my mountain from the sunder side, and drops into the top cut. And it comes out between 2 rocks that lean together, and that is where a person arriving from the pass would first be standing on my ground. So after the day's work, I walked up there, 1,200 paces from the sheds by Rel's count, which she gave me unasked on the 4th evening in a tone I did not care for. I stood at the rocks for a while, and then I walked back down. I did not shout up the path. I did not go up it. It is her path, and she had shut a gate and sent a man down a road to release my house of its obligations. And all I know how to do is stand where the line is and wait to be told something different. The household worked out what I was doing inside a week, because 14 people in a house on a mountain work out everything inside a week, and nobody said one word to me about it for 2 months, which is the kindest thing that has ever been done for me. Una came up in the 5th week with the carts and got it out of orgery in about 11 minutes and put it on the back of that slate with the date, and then she said, 41. I said, 41 what? She said, evenings, and your steward has been counting them. He does not know why he is counting them. He counts everything. And when I asked him, he said 41 without looking up from a hinge. Doha spent that spring becoming very good at his office, and I know how he spent it because Una spent it in a kitchen underneath him, and a kitchen hears a man rehearse. He had rooms at the Ridge now. The voice gets rooms and a clerk and a lamp allowance, and he had all 3. And Una says the lamp was lit past the 3rd gong every night that spring. He was writing the case, and at first it was not a speech. Questions. The voice does not argue, the voice asks, and he was building the order of the asking, and he read them out loud to the wall to hear how they went. Una heard him through a floor about 9 times in one night, working the same question and never once landing it. The nearest he got was, when the warden's arm came out at that feast, was there a decision anywhere inside it? I have thought about that question for years, and I cannot find the crack in it. If she says yes, she is a woman who kills at her own table. If she says no, then the defense of the northern approach to the ridge is a body that acts without asking anybody, including its owner. And there is a thing about Doha that I did not understand until that spring, and that I think most of the ridge has still never understood. He believed it. He was not building that question to hurt her. He had been in the yard, he had seen the mark in the doorpost, and he had come to the honest conclusion that the ridge was being defended by something that could not be governed. He was also, at the same time and in the same body, a man who had been made to stand at the back of a hall with nothing to be, and who was now going to ask those questions in front of every house that had watched him do it. Both of those were true, and neither of them canceled the other. Ilna came up my mountain in the 6th week on a hired pony, alone, which for a pharaoh daughter is roughly the same as swimming a river. She got down in my yard and said the entire sentence without stopping once, which I had never heard her do. She said, "My sister has been called to speak to the council, and I know what she is going to say, and I have come to tell you before she says it." I said, "Sit down and say it." And she did, and I believed her, and I would like that recorded, because 5 years ago, at a winter market, I laughed at this person, and it took her until 19 to try again. She said, "Saren is going to tell them the truth. All of it. The cup, the wine, the 2 men, the woman in the east wing, the witnesses she invited herself, every piece of it in order, in front of the council, without being asked." I said, "Why?" Ilna said, "Because they will ask her whether the warden acted from malice on the night of the banquet when she locked that door, and my sister will say no. To say no properly, she will have to explain what the warden was actually stopping, and my sister cannot say a true thing in a small way." Then she said she has worked out that the only way anybody believes her about the warden is if she gives them the whole of what she did herself, and she is going to do it, and it will finish her, and she knows it, and she is doing it anyway. And I would like somebody outside my house to know that about her. I said, "I have spent a year thinking of your sister as the woman who put horse root in my cup." "She is that as well," Ilna said, and stood up and got back on the pony and went down my mountain in the dark. Maeve came in the 8th week, and she came alone, and she had 1 cart of nothing in particular, and she stood in the yard and said, "Nothing." I said, "Nothing what?" She said, "That is the offer. I have looked at this for 2 months, and I have nothing that would help you, and I am not going to make you refuse a thing on a day like this just so I can hear myself say a number." She stayed for dinner. She sat at my table and ate pear and hard cheese with my steward and my mother's cousin and a kite daughter who has never gone home, and she asked Audrey about the drying sheds and got 40 minutes on it and did not once look at me while it was happening. At the door, she got out the seal on its cord and held it level as she always does, and I did not take it, and she put it back in her coat and said, 62, and went out to the cart. At the wall, every morning at first light, the voice asked the standing, and the master of seniority measured it and gave it to the muster. And every morning for 40 days, it was 3 paces. I was not there. This is Rel's count and Kesta's book and Yuna's slate, and the 3 of them agree, and I have never once been able to look at that column without my chest going wrong. Sacrifice. Afaka Baikandeni. 3333. 40 of them in a row on the back of a wine slate under a ruled line, with the date beside each one, in the hand of a girl who has been keeping the record of my life since I was 18 and had nothing in it worth keeping. The Council of 9 was set for the summer sitting, and the voice posted the question the council would answer. That is his office, and he did it in the correct form on the correct day. The question was whether the ridge is defended by the warden of the ridge, or whether the ridge is defended by what the far country believes about her, and if the second, whether a warden who has been publicly measured to arm's length remains a defense at all. The night before I went down, I asked Kesta a question of my own, in her own room, with the seniority book on the table between us and no one else in it. I said, "Can a house ask the master of seniority to lower its own standing?" She looked at me for a while. Then she said that, in the whole life of that table, no house had ever asked it, that there is no form for it, because nobody ever thought a form would be wanted, and that if a house asked her, she would have to invent one on the spot in front of 9 houses. Then she said, and I would enjoy that enormously, and she asked me to get out of her room and let her go to bed. The summer sitting fills that building the way water fills a boot, and this one filled it 4 days early, because everybody on the ridge with a reason to be there, and everybody without one, came down to hear whether 9 men on 9 stools were going to take the warden off the pass. The round room holds the council and nobody else. Everyone else sits in the long gallery outside it with the doors open. That is the arrangement, and it means 200 people listening to a room they cannot see into. Kesta stood in the doorway with the roll, half in and half out, because that is where the master of seniority stands, and it meant that for 3 days she was the only person on the ridge who could see both the council and the gallery at once. She says the gallery was worse. Arn of House. Vane opened it, and he did not dress it up. He put the question the voice had posted. He put the muster figures, and he put the mark in the barracks doorpost, which 400 men had walked past every day for a month, and which 3 househeads had gone up to look at themselves. Then he said the thing that had been coming since a chalk mark in a barn. He said, "A warden who cannot be approached defends this ridge without lifting a hand. A warden who can be approached is a woman with a wall and 42 men. We have to know which one we have." Vaelka came down from the pass on the second morning, and it was the first time I had seen her since a gate yard, and she came into that room with both gloves on all the way and her hands behind her back. I was in the gallery, 5th house, where a 5th house sits, and I could hear everything and see nothing, and I have decided since that this was a mercy. They asked her about the pass first, which was decent of them. Numbers on the far road, smoke, the state of the wall. She gave it in the order it happened and left nothing in it for comfort, and it took about an hour, and the gallery was quiet for the whole of it. Then Loth of House Ossel said, "Have you at any time in the last year acted to reduce the standing?" "Every time," she said. He said, "Has any person asked you to?" "No person has ever asked me to," she said. He said, "Has the man of House Dell ever moved towards you?" She said, "Not once, in a year, in any room, under any circumstance, including one where he was blind on horse route and could not see the table." She got that out in one breath and then stopped. And then the voice asked his question from the wall, in the correct form with the black cord on his shoulder. He said, "Warden of the Ridge, on the night of the muster feast, did you intend to strike?" When they the gallery went so quiet that I could hear a boy on the stairs 2 floors down. "No," she said. He said, "Could you have stopped it?" "No," she said. He said, "If the master of seniority had been standing where the man of House Dell was standing, would she be alive?" And Vaelka said, "No." Nobody in that room said anything for a while. Then Merrick of House Pharaoh said, out loud, that he had a daughter who wished to speak, and that he had told her not to, and that she was going to anyway, and that the council might as well have her now as have her in the gallery afterwards. Saren came in and gave them all of it. She started with the road, because she starts everything with the road, and she gave the council 11 minutes of easement history that nobody had asked for, and that Kesta says 3 househeads visibly aged during. Then Harn of House Vane said, "The cup," and she stopped, and there was a pause. I could hear the length of a gallery. And she said, "I asked for a strong cup." He said, "Of whom?" She said, "Of the sworn sword of my house." He said, "And what did you understand a strong cup to be?" And she said, "I understood it to be one he would not walk away from." Nobody had asked her that last one. He had put 2 questions to her, and she had answered 3, because a betrothal broken with cause carries the road and the mountain, and an uncaused one carries nothing, and she could not leave that standing unexplained either. She had been 9 years old when the thing was agreed, and 22 when she decided to end it in the only way that paid. Then she named them, the 2 men from the past villages, by name and by village, the woman from the low town, the 4 house heads she had invited before the first course, and the words she had used on each of them, which she remembered exactly, because she remembers everything exactly. Lothach Asher Loth of House Ossel said, "You invited me." And she said, "I invited you, my lord, and you came. And I have thought since that you all came very quickly, for men who had been told only that a matter would repay their attention." That is the sentence that finished her. Kesta says she offered it helpfully, in the voice of a woman clearing up a small point of fact, and that Loth of House Ossel put his hand over his eyes. Then Harn asked the only question that mattered. He said, "Did the Warden of the Ridge lock that door out of malice?" And Saren of House Pharaoh said, "No, she locked it because she could see what was on the stairs, and I know what was on the stairs because I put it there." She was not being brave. I would rather be fair to her, and that means not making her better than she is. She was doing the thing she has done since she was a child. She cannot leave a true statement standing on its own without walking all the way round it and explaining the back of it. It is just that on that morning, in that room, walking all the way round, it was the only honest act anybody performed for 3 days, and it cost her everything she had left, and she did it in front of her father. Doha stood at the wall in the black cord and listened to the woman he had served for 12 years describe, in order, with dates, the evening he had built for her. He could not object. The voice does not argue. The voice asks the questions the council does not wish to be seen asking, and there is no form in which the voice defends himself, because nobody who invented the office ever imagined it being given to a man who might need to. Kesta says he stood absolutely still through every minute of it with his chin up, and that when Surin named the low-town innkeeper who had sold the root, Loth of House, Ossel turned round on his stool and looked at the voice for a long moment and then turned back and did not say anything at all. That was the worst of the 3 days, and it was not even the day of the vote. The vote came on the third afternoon, and it was not a vote on deposing her. It was a vote on whether to put the question of deposing her, which sounds like nothing and is how everything on this ridge actually happens. 6 of the 9 put it. Merrick of House Pharaoh did not, and Byrne of House Kite did not, and Sella of House Calm did not, and the reasons of all 3 are in Kesta's role, and none of them are interesting. The gallery heard 6 and knew what 6 meant, and made a noise, and Ordry, sitting beside me on a bench in the gallery of the Council of 9 on the day they voted to put the deposition of the warden, leaned over. He asked whether we were going to be here past the end of the week, because the second pruning wants doing before the heat, and he had 2 men idle. I said I thought we would be here past the end of the week. He said that was a nuisance, and that he would send word to start without us. Rel, on my other side, said thank you, and meant it, and I have never been able to decide which of the 2 of them I was more grateful to. And then the voice stood off the wall and asked the council for leave to propose the manner of the proof, which his office allows him, and Harn of House Vane gave it to him, and he took the floor of that room with 200 people listening through an open door. He was very good. I have to say that. He had been in a low-town chair for 6 weeks with nothing, and he had built this over a spring of lamp oil, and he stood in the middle of 9 stools and laid it out in about 4 minutes without a paper in his hand. He said, the council cannot depose a warden for what her body does, he said, and the council cannot keep a warden the far country has heard has been walked up to, so the council must know which it is, and there is only one way to know, and it is not a number in a book. Then he said it. He said, the warden of House Sunder holds that the distance is hers to give. Let her give it. Let it go to nothing in this room before the 9 houses, and let the man of House Dell put his hand on her, and if she can hold it, then she has governed it, and this council has nothing to depose. And then he said the last piece, and this is the piece I want you to hold on to, because it is all of him in one sentence. He said, and if she cannot, then we will all have seen it, and no one will ever have to say the word deposition out loud. He was at his absolute height. He had a black cord on his shoulder, 9 house heads on 9 stools, 200 people through an open door, and a proposal that could not be refused without answering it. He had never in his life been standing where he was standing. Kesta says that at that moment he looked through the doorway, down the gallery, to where the 5th house was sitting on a bench, and that his chin came up. Vaelka refused it inside a breath. She said, no. Then she said, I will stand down. Then she said, put it in the roll now. The warden of the ridge resigns the pass to the Council of 9 at the end of the summer sitting. She said, appoint whoever you like, and I will hold the wall until they come. And she said the whole of it in the same voice she uses for the state of a road. The gallery came apart. 200 people got up at once, which is not allowed, and Kesta had to stand in the doorway and shout at a gallery for the first time in 19 years. I got out into the passage because I could not be in there. Yuna came out after me with the jug she was not currently using and said she is not doing it for the pass. I said I know. She said, say it out loud then. And I said, she is doing it because if she says yes and then cannot hold it, the thing that goes on the floor of that room in front of all of them is me. Yuna said, correct, and wrote nothing down, which for Yuna is a form of shouting. I went back in and asked the Master of Seniority for leave to be heard by the Council of 9 at the summer ceremony, which a house of the ridge may do once, and which no house has done since my grandfather was a boy. Nikesta wrote it in the roll. Then she said, 5th house. And I said, about that. And I asked her the thing I had asked her in her own room on a night in the spring. and this time I asked it in a doorway with the council on one side of me and the gallery on the other. I said, I am asking the Master of Seniority to put House Dell back to 9th of 9 before I open my mouth in that room. She said, on what grounds? I said, on the grounds that House Dell went from 9th to 3rd on a distance that was not mine, that I have never moved it, and that when I stand in that room, I am not going to have one man in it able to say the 5th house spoke for its own advancement. Kesta stood in that doorway for about 4 seconds. Then she said, there is no form for it, and I will be obliged to invent one, and I will be inventing it in front of the whole ridge and 200 witnesses. Then she said, and I have waited 19 years for somebody to hand me a thing like this. She read it that evening. She read the 9 houses, and she got to the 5th, and she stopped. And she said, at the request of the house, and there is no form for this, and I am making one. House Dell returns to the 9th of 9. Then she moved us, in front of everybody, on the last evening before the ceremony, back down the entire length of that hall to the 9th table, at the far end by the door, where the last pour comes out of the bottom of the jug with the sediment in it. Una poured it. She has poured at every table on that ridge from the 9th up, and she had just been given the high pour at a muster feast in a gate yard, and on that evening she came the whole length of the hall with the jug against her hip and poured the 9th cup herself, and did not spill a drop. The summer ceremony was set for the following noon in the round room, with the doors open and the gallery full, and the voice had posted the proof in the correct form on the right day. And the form said that the warden of the ridge would be asked the distance, and that the man of House Dell would be asked to close it. They opened the doors of the round room at noon, and the gallery had been full since second light, which means about 160 people stood outside a doorway for 6 hours in summer without being asked to. 9 stools, 9 house heads, Kesta half in and half out of the door with the roll and the rod, the voice at the wall with the black cord, and the warden standing on the floor of that room with both gloves on all the way to the thumb. The voice read the form. He read that the council would ask the distance, and that the man of House Dell would be asked to close it, and then he read the second paper. It was the warden's resignation of the pass, entered 2 days earlier and standing. Harn of House Vane said, in the presence of a resignation, the proof is moot, and this council will proceed to the appointment of a new warden of the High Pass. There was a noise in the gallery that Kesta had to stand up into. And then the Master of Seniority said, before the council proceeds, the 9th house has leave to be heard. And she said the words 9th house in a voice that carried the length of that gallery, because she had spent 19 years learning how. I came in. It is about 11 paces from the gallery door to the middle of that floor, and I counted them, because I have become a man who counts things. And Rel of House Kite is entirely to blame. I want to tell you what I had. I had no paper. I had no house behind me worth the name, because I had asked for that myself the night before and got it. I had a pair of my father's boots on, and the left one still leaks. I said, my lords, I am the 9th house of 9, and I have nothing to gain in this room. And the Master of Seniority arranged that at my request last night in front of all of you, so you may put that aside and listen to the rest. Then I said, you are trying to find out whether the warden governs what her body does. You will not get that from her. She has been governing it every day for 11 years, and none of you counted a single one of them, because a thing that does not happen has no number, and your books only take numbers. I said, so count something else. Count the men who came inside 3 paces of her in 11 years. It is 4, and one of them was her husband, and every one of the 4 walked in. I said, and count the ones who did not. It is everybody else on this ridge, for 11 years, and the reason is that they were frightened, and I would like the council to think for a moment about what a fence made of fright is actually worth. Then I gave them the barn, because the barn is all of my argument, and because it happened in front of every one of them. I said, last winter, 40 men stood on a chalk mark in an armory learning to hold a distance, and the best sword on this ridge came in 3 times and stopped at 5 and 4.5 and 4. And I said every one of those men was afraid of her, and every one of them was there, because they had stopped being afraid enough to try. I said, that is what fear does. It holds a line beautifully, and then one winter it wears thin, and there is always a next man, and he is always closer than the last one. A fence that is only fright stands exactly until the first person who is not frightened, and that person is coming whether this council appoints him or not. Then I said the thing I had thought about on a mountain for 2 months, while walking up to a gap between two rocks every evening like an idiot, and I said it badly. And I am going to give it to you the way I said it, and not the way I have improved it since. I said, the only fence that holds is one somebody respects, and you cannot test whether a fence is respected by looking at the fence. You have to look at the person standing outside it. I said, so do not ask her to prove anything. She has nothing left to prove, and you would not know how to read it if she did. Ask me. I am the other side of it. I am the only measurement you have got. Loth of House Ossel said, said, name the thing you are proposing. I said that I close the distance to nothing, in this room, at her word and not at mine. I stop where she says stop, and I go back when she says back. You want to know whether the thing is governed. Watch it be governed. Merrick of House Pharaoh said, do you understand what is in the doorpost at the high pass? I have had my fingers in it, my lord, I said. Burn of House Kite said, are you doing this because you are in love with her? The gallery made a noise, and I said, my lord, I am doing it because somebody told me where the line was when I was 6 years old, and I have never once had a reason to disbelieve them, and it is the only thing I have ever brought to this. Then Vaelka said, no. She said it to the council and not to me. She said, I have resigned the pass, and the resignation is entered, and it stands. And this council will not put a man of the 9th house on the floor of a room to find out what my arm does. And I turned round and said the only thing I have ever said to her that I had planned in advance. I said, Warden, you have moved that distance 11 times in a year, and every single time you told me not to move my feet. I am asking you for one of them the other way round. Tell me to move mine. The room did not make a sound. Kesta says that in the roll she wrote only the word silence, which is not a thing she is permitted to write. Then Vaelka of House Sunder said, withdraw the resignation, and Harn of House Vane said, it is withdrawn, faster than any man has ever agreed to anything on this ridge. Kesta came onto the floor with the rod, and put me where I stood and laid it out, and she measured it once for the record, before anything happened, and she said, 3 paces, and the gallery set it back through the doorway, and she did not stop them. Vaelka said, come to 2. I came to 2. It is 1 step. I have taken about 9 million steps in my life, and that one took a very long time. And the room came off my shoulders somewhere in the middle of it, and I could hear the rod being set down behind me. Kesta said, 2 paces. Vaelka said, come to 1. I came to 1, and at 1 I could see the stitching on the wrist of her glove again, and her jaw, and the place under her ear where the muscle was going. And I stopped exactly where the word had put me, and put my hands down by my sides where they live. Kesta said, 1 pace. And somebody in the gallery started to say it back and got as far as the first word and stopped himself, and it was the loudest silence I have ever stood in. Then Vaelka said, arm's length, and I went, and Kesta said it, and then Vaelka did not say anything at all for a while. And I need to be accurate about what happened next because it is the only thing in this whole business I have ever been asked about. She took off the last glove. She did it with her teeth because her other hand was shaking too hard to do it, and she did it in front of 9 house heads and a doorway with 160 people in it, and she dropped it on the floor of the round room and left it there. Then she said, come to nothing. Then she said, and if I say back, you go back, exactly, and not to the left. And I said, I have never gone to the left in my life. I went to nothing. Nothing is not a pace. Nothing is standing in front of somebody with your chest a hand from theirs and your feet between their feet, and there is no distance in it at all, and no room for anything to be measured. Her right hand came up. It came up about 4 inches, and it stopped, and it stayed there, and her whole arm was locked in a way that I felt rather than saw, because at nothing you do not see people. You are simply near them. Do not move, she said. I did not move. I have never in my life been so good at anything. Somewhere behind me, the master of seniority was down on the floor with a rod against the boards, and somewhere behind her, 9 house heads were on 9 stools, and none of that was in the room as far as I was concerned. I have no idea how long it took. Kesta says 11 seconds. Rel, who was in the gallery and who counts, says 19. Yuna, who was on a bench, says it was the longest thing that has ever happened. Then her hand came down out of the air and she put it bare, palm flat, on my chest, and she left it there. Behind me, the rod came down on the boards, and Kesta gave the number to the room. 0. The gallery did not say it back, and the council did not say it back, and the only sound in that building was 160 people breathing out at the same time, which I am told carried into the kitchens 2 floors down. Vaelka said, "Into the muster," and Kesta said, "Warden," and Vaelka said, "All of it." And Kesta wrote it, standing up on the floor with the book against her forearm. And then the Council of 9 turned, all 9 of them at once, and looked at the man in the black cord standing at the wall, because he had built it. Every piece of that noon was his. He had proposed the manner of the proof with the whole ridge listening. He had said out loud that if she could hold it, then this council had nothing to depose, and he had added, because he cannot help himself, that afterwards nobody would ever have to say the word again. And the form requires the voice to certify it. That is what the office is. The voice asks, and the voice certifies, and there is no other mouth in the room permitted to close a proof that the voice has opened. Harn of House Vane said, "Voice of the council, is the proof answered?" He stood there. Kesta says it was about 4 seconds, and that his chin was still up for 2 of them. Then he said it. "My lords," he said, "the proof is answered." He said it in a clear voice that carried into the gallery, because he has always spoken well, and that is how all of it ended, with the man who bought the root and chose the wine and hired the 2 men and stood at a chalk mark in a barn for 4 nights certifying, with his own mouth, in front of every house on the ridge, that the woman he had spent a spring trying to unseat had governed her own arm at a distance of nothing. The council sat until the 3rd gong, and then Harn of House Vane read every line of it out into the gallery, and it went like this. The warden of the ridge is confirmed in the pass, and the standing of the warden is struck from the muster roll entirely, on the grounds that it was never a work of defense and should never have been entered in a book of walls and horses. The office of the voice, revived once in 11 generations for a single question, is retired, the question being answered. Road easement across Mount Dell is extinguished, not suspended. House Pharaoh keeps its own road and may build it up its own mountain. And Kesta observed out loud that this would be considerably more difficult, and was told by the master of her own council to keep it for the role. Saren of House Pharaoh is set aside from the heirship of her house by the motion of her father, who did it himself so that no other man would have to, and Ilna of House Pharaoh, who is 19 and who once told a boy at a winter market to mind who poured for him, is named heir in her place. And the seniority of House Dell was referred to the master of seniority, who put us 2nd of 9 above Tor and below Sunder, and who did it before I had finished getting off the floor. I objected. I said I had asked for 9th the day before, and I had meant it. Kesta said that a house may ask once, that I had used mine, and that she was not going to invent a second form in the same week for a man who cannot read a table. Doha went out down the middle of the floor, past every house, from the 1st to the 9th. It is the longest walk in that building, and he had done it once before. He had no cord and no badge, and there was nowhere for him to go. Kesta stopped him at the 9th table and put her hand flat on the end of it, and tapped it twice with 2 fingers, as she does before she names who a place belongs to. And she said, "Sit down. There is a place at the 9th table for a man with no house." I checked. He sat down at the 9th table. He is there still, most evenings. Nobody talks to him much, and he has never once tried to explain himself to anybody, and I have decided that is the most dignified thing about him. The summer feast was 3 days later in the great hall, and Kesta seated all of it by who was glad of whom, which she had done once in a gate yard, and had been waiting 19 years to do in a building with a roof on it. She got permission by pointing out that there is no form forbidding it, which is how everything on this ridge is done that anybody actually wants. Vaelka sat in the middle of the long side of the high table, with a person on either side of her, at a hand's distance all evening, in a full hall with 200 people in it, and a fire and a noise you had to lean through. She has told me since that she did not hear one word anybody said to her for the first hour, and that she spent the whole of it working out what to do with her hands, and that she has never been so tired in her life. She sat there anyway, and about halfway through the evening, somebody down the table asked her a question about the far road, and she answered it with her mouth full, and that was the end of 11 years. Yuna poured the 1st cup and the 9th. She had asked Kesta for the 9th specially, and Kesta put her name in the seniority book to do it, which has never had a servant's name in it in 140 years, and which now has one, near the bottom, in Kesta's own hand. Rel of Housekite fell asleep at the table at the 4th hour, with her counting stick still in her fist, and her cheek on her forearm, in front of the entire hall, and nobody woke her. And Byrne of Housekite came round the table, and put his own coat over his daughter, and went back to his seat without saying anything. Ilna talked for 3 hours to strangers. Maeve came down the hall and said 63, and offered me 40 crates of frost pear, a year at the top of the market with her house name on the paper, and I said yes, and she was so appalled that she had to go and sit down. Ordry asked, at the 9th hour of that feast, in front of the Warden of the Ridge, and the heir of House Pharaoh, and the second house of 9, whether anybody knew when the picking was going to start this year, because the North Face had come on early 2 years running, and he was not going to be caught out a 3rd time. Somebody down the hall asked me the question that everybody has asked me since, which is how a man of the 9th house came to find the one door on the ridge that nobody opens. I said I was looking for the east wing.
This was never about a woman who could kill, or a boy who was brave, because neither of those is true of either of them. It was about a line, and about the two things a line can be made of. Fear will hold a line for years, and fear wears thin, and the day it wears through, there is nothing standing there at all. Respect holds it for as long as one person is willing to wait outside it to be told. That is the strange gift in a boundary that somebody honors. It does not shut a person away from the world. It becomes the one piece of ground on which anybody can safely come near them, and the closest thing there is to being let in.